a man on the verge of losing everything, a woman ridiculed by the entire town, and a marriage orchestrated to utterly destroy him. When the richest cattle tycoons in Texas pressure Caleb Hartwell into marrying the woman everyone considers a burden, no one suspects this will be the beginning of a war that will change the entire frontier. They think they're signing the death warrant for his ranch. They're wrong. Follow my story to the end, and don't forget to like and leave a comment with the city you're viewing from, so I know how far this story has come. The bank in Larkspur Hollow smelled like old paper and cigar smoke, and Caleb Hartwell had come to hate both. He sat across from Otis Pruitt, the bank manager, with his hat in his lap and his jaw tight enough to crack a tooth. Outside the window, a wagon rattled past on the dirt street, and somewhere a dog was barking at nothing in particular. Caleb wished he could be that dog. At least the dog didn't owe anybody money. $3,200, Pruitt said, sliding a paper across the desk like it was something distasteful he wanted off his hands. Due in 6 weeks, Mr. Hartwell. I don't make the rules. The bank's the bank. I know what the bank is, Otis. Caleb's voice came out flatter than he meant it to. I've known you since we were boys stealing peaches off Widow Calloway's tree. You don't have to talk to me like I'm some stranger walking in off the road. Pruitt had the decency to look uncomfortable, at least. He shifted in his chair, glanced toward the door like he was checking nobody was listening, and lowered his voice. It ain't me, Caleb. You know whose money sits behind half the loans in this county now? The Tarrants bought controlling interest in this bank 8 months back. I just sign where they tell me to sign. There it was. The name that explained everything wrong with Caleb's life for the last 2 years. The Tarrant family had come into the valley like a slow poison, first buying up the smaller spreads that struggled after the drought, then buying the water rights along Cottonwood Creek, then buying the loyalty of half the county council with dinners and favors and the kind of money that made men forget what their fathers used to believe in. Now they owned 3 of the 4 biggest ranches within 50 miles, and they wanted a 4th. They wanted Caleb's. 6 weeks, Caleb repeated, mostly to himself. I'm sorry, Pruitt said, and for a second he almost sounded like he meant it. If there was any other way, there's always another way, Otis. Just depends on who's willing to find it. Caleb stood, settled his hat back on his head, and walked out without shaking the man's hand. The late afternoon sun hit him like a slap when he stepped onto the boardwalk. Larkspur Hollow wasn't much of a town. One main street, a church nobody had bothered to mention to Caleb that week, which was just as well. A general store, a saloon, and a scattering of houses leaning against each other like tired old men. But it was home, and the Hartwell Ranch sat 11 miles north of it, and that ranch was the only thing standing between Caleb and absolutely nothing. His father had built that ranch out of rock and stubbornness. 40 years of work, of burying 2 wives and 1 son who died of fever before he turned 6, of breaking horses and breaking his own back to leave something behind. And now it was going to be swallowed up by a family who'd never worked a day of honest labor in their lives, because the rain hadn't fallen right for 3 years running, and the cattle market had gone soft, and the bank, Caleb's bank, the one his father used to drink coffee with the old manager in, now answered to men who wanted him gone. He was still standing there working his jaw when a voice he recognized far too well called out from across the street. Hartwell! There he is, the man of the hour. Reginald Tarrant crossed toward him with that easy, loose-limbed walk rich men have when they've never once worried about where their next meal was coming from. He wore a gray suit that cost more than most ranch hands made in a season, and his mustache was waxed into points that Caleb always found himself wanting to set on fire. Reginald, Caleb said, not bothering to make it sound friendly. I hear you had a meeting with Otis. Reginald stopped a few feet away, hooking his thumbs into his vest pockets. Behind him, 2 of his men loitered by the saloon, watching with the bored patience of dogs waiting to be let off a leash. 6 weeks is a tight window, I'd imagine, especially for a man running cattle alone, no wife, no sons to help with the work. I manage fine. Do you? Reginald's smile widened, slow and unpleasant. Funny. From where I'm standing, it looks like a man drowning real slow, hoping nobody notices till he's already under. Caleb didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't end in him putting his fist through that smug face, and he wasn't about to give Reginald Tarrant the satisfaction of dragging him into a fight in the middle of Main Street. "I'll have your money," Caleb said instead. "Every dollar, by the deadline." "I genuinely hope you do." Reginald's tone said the exact opposite. "My family would hate to see the Hartwell name disappear from this valley. Truly." He tipped his hat, the gesture dripping with mockery, and walked off toward the saloon with his men falling in step behind him, already laughing about something. Caleb stood there a long moment, fists curled at his sides, before he made himself walk to where his horse was tied. He had a long ride back to the ranch and a lot of thinking to do, and none of the thoughts were good ones. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he rode out to the Whitfield place, not because he had business there, but because old Daniel Whitfield was about the only man left in the valley who still talked to him straight, without an agenda hanging off every sentence like a burr caught in wool. He found Daniel on the porch, whittling something shapeless out of a piece of pine, his hound dog asleep at his feet. "You look like a man who just got told bad news twice in one day," Daniel said without looking up. "Feels about right." Caleb dismounted, looped the reins over the porch rail, and sat heavily on the top step. "Bank's calling the loan. 6 weeks. And the Tarrants own the bank now, so you can imagine how friendly that conversation went." Daniel's knife stopped moving. 6 weeks? That ranch has been in your family longer than this town's had a proper name. "Don't I know it?" They sat in silence a while, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. The hound dog twitched in his sleep, chasing something only he could see. "There's one thing might help you," Daniel said eventually. "Don't know if you'll want to hear it." "I'll take anything at this point." Daniel set his knife down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at Caleb with an expression that was equal parts careful and sympathetic. "The county's got a marriage clause on certain land grants. Old law goes back to when the territory was first being settled, meant to keep families on the land instead of selling off to speculators. If a man's unmarried and his ranch falls under that grant, the bank's got more legal room to push foreclosure through quick. But if he's married, has a household, a family invested in the land, the bank's got to give him a longer grace period before they can force a sale. Could buy you another year, maybe more." Caleb stared at him. "You're telling me I need a wife in 6 weeks. I'm telling you the law gives a married rancher more rope than a bachelor one. That's all I'm saying. And where exactly am I supposed to find a wife in 6 weeks, Daniel? Order one through the mail catalog?" Daniel almost smiled at that, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Funny you mention it. There's a woman come through town about 2 months back, staying with her aunt over on the east side. Maribel Connolly. Came out from Georgia after her folks passed, looking for some kind of fresh start, I reckon. Decent woman, from what I hear. Smart, too. She's been helping old Doc Ainsley with his accounts since she got here, on account of her being good with numbers." "And what's the catch?" Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation told Caleb everything he needed to know before the man even opened his mouth again. "Folks in town haven't been kind to her," Daniel admitted. "She's a big woman, Caleb, heavy set, and some of the wives around here, well, you know how this town can be. They've made it real clear she's not exactly desirable in their eyes. There's been talk, cruel talk. I won't repeat the half of it." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, an old discomfort he didn't have a name for. He'd grown up watching his mother get whispered about for being too plain-spoken, too unwilling to bow her head when men thought she should. He didn't have much patience left for towns that decided a person's worth based on how they looked standing in a doorway. "That doesn't sound like a catch to me," he said slowly. "Sounds like a town full of fools." Daniel studied him for a moment. "Could be. But you'd be marrying a stranger to save your land, Caleb. That's not a small thing, whatever her character." "None of this is small," Caleb said, standing, brushing the dust off his trousers. "Might as well be the kind of not small that gives me a fighting chance." No, it took him 2 days to work up the nerve to ride into town and find her, and even then he nearly turned back twice. He found Maribel Connolly behind the Ainsley house, in the small garden plot she'd apparently taken to tending, on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, pulling weeds with the kind of focused fury most people reserve for things that actually mattered to them. She looked up when his shadow fell across the row of bean plants, and Caleb saw, in the half-second before her expression settled into careful neutrality, a flash of something tired and braced, Like she was used to people's faces doing something unkind the moment they looked at her, and she'd already steeled herself for it. "Can I help you?" Her voice was steadier than her posture suggested. There was an edge to it, a wariness she didn't bother hiding. "Miss Connolly?" Caleb pulled his hat off, because his mother had raised him to do that much at least. "My name's Caleb Hartwell. I run a ranch about 11 miles north of here." "I know who you are." She didn't stand. "Whole town's been talking about your trouble with the bank for a week now. Word travels fast when it's somebody's misfortune." That stung more than he expected, mostly because it was true. "Then maybe you already know why I'm here." Now she did stand, brushing dirt from her knees, and faced him directly. Not with hostility exactly, but with the flat, assessing look of someone who'd learned the hard way not to assume good intentions from strangers. "I can't say that I do, Mr. Hartwell." "Enlighten me." He hadn't planned the words. He told himself the whole ride over that he'd find some careful, gentle way to say it. But standing there in front of her steady gaze, every careful word he'd rehearsed dried up in his throat, and what came out instead was the plain, ugly truth. "I'm about to lose my family's ranch. The bank's calling my loan due in 6 weeks and I don't have the money, and I won't have it by then. Not honestly, anyway. There's an old territorial law. Married men get more time before foreclosure than bachelors. I need a wife, Miss Connolly. I came here to ask if you'd consider being mine. In name, in practice, whatever arrangement suits you. I can't offer you romance, and I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, but I can offer you a roof, a fair partnership, and my word that I'd treat you decent every day of it." The silence that followed was long enough that Caleb started to regret every single word. Maribel's face had gone carefully blank, but her eyes were sharp, working through something. "You're proposing marriage to a woman you've never spoken to in your life because you need a legal loophole. That's the plain truth of it, yes. Most men would have dressed that up a little more. Most men aren't standing where I'm standing." He held her gaze. "I figured you'd see through dressing it up anyway. Didn't seem worth insulting you twice in one conversation." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but something close enough to its cousin. "Do you know what they say about me in this town, Mr. Hartwell?" "I've heard some of it." "Heard the kind word version, I'd wager. They call me a heifer behind my back. The Tucker boys oinked at me outside the dry goods store last month in front of half the street, and not a single person told them to stop." Her voice didn't waver, but Caleb caught the small, controlled breath she took before continuing. "So forgive me if I find it hard to believe a rancher with a name and a reputation wants to marry me for any reason that isn't desperate and convenient." "It is desperate," Caleb said honestly. "I won't lie about that. But I didn't come here because I think you're some kind of consolation prize, Miss Connolly. Daniel Whitfield told me you've been keeping Doc Ainsley's book straight since you got here, that you're sharp with numbers and sharper with sense. That's worth something to a man trying to save a ranch. More than this town seems to think you're worth, from what I'm hearing." Maribel was quiet again, studying him in a way that made Caleb feel like she could see clean through to whatever he was actually thinking, which was more than a little unsettling given he wasn't entirely sure himself. "I don't have anywhere else to be," she said finally, quietly. "My aunt's a kind woman, but she's got 6 mouths to feed already, and I'm one too many. I came out here for a fresh start, and so far all I've found is a different kind of unkindness than the one I left behind." "I'm not asking you to fall in love with me," Caleb said. "I'm asking you to be my partner. There's a difference, and I think it's one that might actually work for both of us." She looked down at the dirt under her fingernails, then back up at him. "And if I say no? Then I thank you for your time and go find some other way to lose my ranch with a little dignity and tact." That, finally, won the ghost of a real smile from her. Quick, surprised, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "You're an odd man, Mr. Hartwell. My mother used to say the same thing, usually right before she told me to go muck out the stalls." "Give me a day to think on it," Maribel said. "This isn't a decision I'll make standing in a bean patch." "Take 2, if you need them." Caleb settled his hat back on his head. "I'll be back day after tomorrow for your answer." She said yes. Caleb never did learn the full shape of what went into that decision, whether it was the unkindness of the town finally outweighing her caution, or some calculation about her own future she'd worked out alone in the dark, or simply the fact that a stranger had looked her in the eye and treated her like a person worth a fair offer instead of a joke. Whatever it was, 2 days later she stood on Doc Ainsley's porch and told him plainly, "I'll marry you, Mr. Hartwell, but I want it understood. I'm not coming to your ranch to sit by the fire and look pretty. I expect to work. I expect to have a say in how things are run, and I expect you to treat that as the bargain it is, not as charity." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Caleb said, and meant it. The wedding, when it came, was about as far from romantic as a wedding could get and still technically qualify as one. They stood in front of the circuit judge in the back room of the county clerk's office, Daniel Whitfield and his wife as witnesses, Maribel in a plain gray dress that fit her like she'd sewn it herself, which Caleb learned later she had, and Caleb in the same coat he'd worn to his father's funeral because it was the only one he owned that didn't have a tear in it somewhere. Word got out fast, the way it always did in a town that size, and by the time they walked out of the clerk's office, a small crowd had gathered to watch. Not out of celebration, Caleb realized quickly, but out of something closer to morbid curiosity. "Well, would you look at that?" came a voice from the gathered crowd, pitched just loud enough to carry. "Hartwell really did it. Married the fat girl to save his ranch." A ripple of laughter went through the onlookers. Caleb felt Maribel stiffen beside him, her spine going rigid, her chin lifting in that particular way people lift their chin when they're refusing to let something show on their face. "Guess he figured a big woman could carry a big debt," another voice added, and the laughter swelled. Caleb stopped walking, turned, found the source of the second comment. One of the Tucker boys, grinning like he'd said something clever instead of something cruel. "You got something else you want to say?" Caleb's voice was low and even, but there was an edge under it that made the laughter die fast. The Tucker boy's grin faltered. "Just having a laugh, Hartwell. No offense meant." "Offense was taken." Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "My wife just stood up in that office and gave her name to a man with nothing left to offer but a falling down ranch and a mountain of debt. That took more backbone than I've seen out of half this town in years. You want to laugh at somebody, go find a mirror." Nobody said anything else. The crowd thinned out fast after that, the way crowds do when the entertainment stops being free. Maribel didn't speak until they were well clear of town, riding north along the dusty road toward the ranch, the late afternoon sun stretching their shadows long across the road ahead. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "Do what?" "Defend me. Back there." She kept her eyes on the road ahead, not on him. "I've had worse said to my face plenty of times. I know how to let it roll off." "Doesn't mean you should have to," Caleb said. "And I wasn't doing it for you, not entirely. I was doing it because a man who lets people talk about his wife that way in front of him isn't much of a man, whatever the arrangement underneath the marriage might be." Maribel was quiet a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its careful edge. "I appreciate it, even if I'm not used to it." "Get used to it," Caleb said simply. "I meant what I said back at the clerk's office, near enough. We're partners now. That's not a word I throw around loose." The Hartwell Ranch sat in a wide, shallow valley. The house a sturdy, two-story affair Caleb's father had built plank by plank with his own hands. The barn leaning a little more than it used to, but still standing. The corrals empty in more places than they should have been after 2 years of selling off stock to make payments that never seemed to shrink the debt, no matter how much Caleb threw at it. Maribel stood in the yard taking it all in. The dry, cracked earth where a garden used to be, the listing fence posts, the cattle scattered thin across the far pasture. And Caleb watched her face for the disappointment he half expected to see. It never came. Instead, she walked toward the dry garden plot and crouched down, running her fingers through the dust the way she had through the dirt back at the Ainsley place. "This soil's not dead," she said, "just thirsty. Where's your water coming from?" "Cottonwood Creek, mostly. Terrence bought up most of the upstream rights 2 years back, though, so what comes through here's whatever they don't dam off or divert first." "And nothing else? No wells, no springs?" "There's an old well by the south fence, but it's been dry as a bone since before I was born, far as I know." Maribel stood, brushing off her hands, and looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the look of someone already working a problem over in her mind. "Far as you know isn't the same as the truth of it, Mr. Hartwell. Caleb, he said. If we're going to be married, you might as well use my given name. Caleb, then. The ghost of that quick smile again. I'd like to see your father's old land records, if you have them. Surveys, deeds, anything. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. He didn't know it yet, standing there in the dusty yard with the sun going orange behind the western ridge. But that request, that simple, practical desire to see the truth written down in ink rather than trust the assumptions everyone had been making for years, was going to change everything about to happen to them both. That night, after a supper of beans and cornbread eaten mostly in the careful, polite silence of two strangers learning each other's habits, Caleb showed her into his father's old study, a small room off the main hall stacked with ledgers, deeds, and yellowed paper that hadn't been disturbed in longer than Caleb cared to admit. It's a mess, he warned. Never had much reason to go through it proper. Always figured what I needed to know, I already knew. That's usually when the most important things get missed, Maribel said, already pulling the first stack of papers toward her, settling into the old wooden chair like she'd been doing this her whole life. Go on to bed if you want. I do my best thinking at night, and I imagine you've got cattle to see to before sunup. Caleb hesitated in the doorway. You don't have to do this tonight. I know I don't have to. She didn't look up from the papers. I want to. Sitting idle's never suited me, and I'd rather understand exactly what we're working with than lie awake wondering. He left her there, the lamplight throwing her shadow long against the wall, papers rustling as she worked. It was, he thought, as he climbed the stairs to his own room, the first time in longer than he could remember that he'd gone to bed without that familiar, hollow dread sitting in his chest like a stone. It didn't last. The dread came back soon enough. It always did these days. But for one evening at least, he'd had a few hours of something close to hope, and that was more than he'd had in longer than he cared to count. The next morning, Caleb came down to find Maribel already at the kitchen table, 3 ledgers open in front of her, a hand-drawn map of the property spread across the rest of the surface, her hair coming loose from its pins and dark circles starting under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept much, if at all. You look like you've been up all night, he said. I have. She didn't look tired, exactly. She looked alert in the particular way people look when they've found something. Sit down. I want to show you something. He sat. She slid one of the old surveys toward him, a map drawn in faded ink, the kind of document that had probably been filed away and forgotten the moment the original land grant was finalized. This is your father's original survey, filed back when the territory still issued grants instead of selling outright, she said, tracing a line with her finger. See this marking here, south of the dry well? It's labeled as a natural spring source. Not a well? A spring. Underground, but documented, going back to the original survey. Caleb stared at the marking. I've never heard a word about a spring on this land in my life. That's because it's never been developed, far as I can tell. Your father probably never had reason to dig for it. Cottonwood Creek would have been plenty back then, before anybody started buying up the rights upstream. But the documentation's right here, filed with the county. If this survey's accurate, and if the spring's still flowing underground the way it was when this was drawn up, you're sitting on water that nobody else in this valley has access to. And if it's not still flowing, then we've lost nothing but a few days digging, Maribel said. But if it is, Caleb, this changes everything. This isn't just enough water to save your herd. Properly managed, this could supply water to half the smaller ranches in this valley, the ones the Tarrants have been squeezing dry for 2 years. Caleb sat back in his chair, turning the implications over slowly, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. And he'd learned the hard way over the last 2 years not to trust that feeling too quickly. You found this in one night, he said. Going through papers nobody's touched in years. I'm good with numbers, and I'm good with patience, Maribel said simply. Most people overlook things because they're not looking close enough, or they've already decided what they expect to find before they start looking. I don't have the luxury of deciding things in advance, Caleb. Never have. So I just look at what's actually there. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, past the assumptions the whole town had clearly built around her, past his own initial desperation that had brought him to her door in the first place, and saw for the first time exactly what Daniel Whitfield had been trying to tell him without quite saying it outright. This was not a consolation. This was not a convenient arrangement to satisfy an old territorial law. This was a woman who might, against every odd stacked against both of them, actually be capable of saving everything Caleb had been about to lose. "All right," he said slowly. "Where do we start digging?" They started that same afternoon, Caleb and the two ranch hands he still had left, Pete Sorensen, gray-haired and skeptical, and his nephew Will, barely 17 and willing to believe in anything if it meant steady work. Out at the dry well by the south fence, with Maribel's survey spread across a crate, and her standing over them with her sleeves rolled up, directing where to dig based on the old markings. "You sure about this?" Pete asked, leaning on his shovel, sweat already darkening his shirt in the afternoon heat. "Been dry as a bone out here my whole life, Caleb. Your daddy never said nothing about a spring." "My daddy never had Mrs. Hartwell going through his survey papers either," Caleb said, and felt strange saying it. Mrs. Hartwell, a title that still didn't sit familiar on his tongue, attached to a woman he'd known less than 2 weeks. Maribel, crouched by the old well opening with a length of rope and a stone tied to the end, didn't look up. "Dig southwest of the well, about 30 feet. The survey marks the spring source there, not directly under the well shaft itself. Whoever dug this well originally must have missed it by a stretch." Pete looked dubious but started digging anyway, muttering something under his breath about women and books and how things used to be done. Will, for his part, dug with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet learned to be disappointed by hard work that didn't pay off. They dug for 2 days. Caleb's hands blistered, then calloused over again the way they used to before 2 years of debt had turned most of his labor into worry instead of work. Maribel stayed out there every hour of it, not just directing, but digging herself when Pete's back gave out for an afternoon. Her dress streaked with dirt, her hands raw, refusing every suggestion that she go back to the house and rest. "I didn't marry a man to sit in his kitchen while he does all the work that might save us both," she told Caleb flatly when he suggested it, and he didn't bring it up again. On the morning of the 3rd day, Will's shovel struck something that wasn't dirt, a give in the ground, a softness. And then, slowly, unmistakably, a darkening of the soil that spread and spread until water began seeping up from below, clear and cold and absolutely real. Pete stood there with his mouth open. "Well, I'll be damned." Caleb dropped to his knees beside the widening pool of water, dug his hands into it, felt the cold shock of it against his blistered palms, and looked up to find Maribel standing over him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the careful, braced neutrality she'd worn since the day he met her, but something open and bright and almost disbelieving of her own success. "There it is," she said quietly. "There's your spring, Caleb." He laughed. Actually laughed. The first real laugh he could remember in longer than 2 years, and looked up at her, water dripping off his hands. "There's our spring, Maribel. Ours." Something passed between them in that moment, standing in the mud with cold spring water soaking through Caleb's trousers and the late morning sun beating down on all of them. Something neither of them had words for yet. Something that hadn't existed 2 weeks ago when Caleb had ridden into town with nothing but desperation and an old territorial law to offer a stranger. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the start of something neither of them had expected to find, born out of dirt and debt, and a piece of paper nobody else had bothered to read closely enough to find the truth buried underneath it. Word of the spring reached the Tarrant family faster than Caleb would have liked. It was Pete who let it slip, not out of malice but out of plain pride, mentioning it to a man at the feed store who happened to mention it to another man who happened to drink at the same saloon table as one of Reginald Tarrant's hired hands. By the time a full week had passed, half the valley knew the Hartwell Ranch had struck water nobody else had access to, and the other half was about to find out the hard way. Reginald Tarrant rode out to the ranch himself on a gray gelding too fine for the dusty road. His father, Hollis Tarrant, beside him on an even finer horse, 2 hired men trailing behind at a respectful distance. Caleb watched them come from the porch, Maribel beside him, both of them already knowing exactly what this visit was going to be about, before a single word got spoken. "Hartwell," Hollis Tarrant said by way of greeting, not bothering to dismount. He was an older, harder version of his son. Same waxed mustache gone gray, Same easy cruelty sitting just under a veneer of politeness. Here congratulations are in order. Married and struck water, all in the same month. Quite a turn of fortune. It is, Caleb said evenly. Funny how things work out. Funny, Hollis agreed, though his tone suggested he found nothing about it amusing at all. I'll be direct with you, son, since we're neighbors and I've always believed in plain talk between neighbors. That spring sits on land my family has had its eye on for some time. I'd be willing to make you a generous offer for the parcel south of your well, generous enough to clear your debt with the bank entirely, with money left over. The land's not for sale, Caleb said. Everything's for sale, given the right price. Hollis's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'd encourage you to think it over before you answer too quick. Pride's a fine thing for a man with money to spare. For a man 6 weeks from foreclosure, it's a luxury he can't always afford. Maribel spoke before Caleb could answer, her voice calm and level in a way that surprised even Caleb, who was only beginning to learn the full measure of her. Mr. Tarrant, with respect, that spring isn't just a parcel of land to my husband. It's documented water rights tied to the original land grant, predating any purchases your family's made in this valley. Selling it would mean selling the one thing standing between dozens of smaller ranches and total ruin, given how thoroughly your family's bought up every other water source for 15 miles in every direction. Hollis's eyes flicked to her, sharp and assessing, clearly recalculating something about the wife he'd dismissed without a second thought before this exact moment. You've done your research, Mrs. Hartwell. I do my research before I make decisions, Maribel said. It tends to save a great deal of trouble later. It would save you trouble now, Hollis said, his tone hardening just slightly, to take my offer and walk away comfortable, rather than dig in and find out exactly how much trouble my family is capable of causing for people who refuse to be reasonable. Is that a threat? Caleb asked. It's a fact of business, Mr. Hartwell. Nothing more. Hollis gathered his reins. Think it over. I'll give you a week before I assume your answer's a final no, and act accordingly. They rode off without further courtesy, leaving Caleb and Maribel standing on the porch in the settling dust. He's not going to take no for an answer easy, Maribel said quietly. No, Caleb agreed. He's not. He looked out at the dry pasture, at the fence line that marked the edge of everything his father had built and everything he was now responsible for protecting. Guess we'd better figure out what we're going to do about that. The week that followed was quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before a storm breaks. Caleb and Maribel worked the spring, channeling water through old irrigation trenches Caleb's father had dug decades ago and never had reason to use, watching the cracked earth of the old garden plot slowly soften and darken with moisture for the first time in years. Pete and Will worked alongside them, and slowly, cautiously, a few of the smaller ranchers in the valley started riding out to see for themselves whether the rumors were true. Among them was Joseph Mercer, whose 40 acres sat just southeast of the Hartwell land, whose cattle had been thinning for 2 years on the same dried-up grass and dwindling creek water that had nearly broken Caleb himself. Heard you struck a spring, Mercer said, standing at the fence line, looking past Caleb to where the irrigation trenches ran dark and wet through the field. Heard it's a good one. It is, Caleb said. Mercer was quiet a moment, turning his hat over in his hands the way men do when they're working up to ask for something they're not sure they have the right to ask for. I won't lie to you, Hartwell. I'm 2 bad seasons from losing everything my granddaddy built. Cottonwood Creek's barely a trickle since the Tarrants dammed it upstream, and I don't have the money to fight them in court even if I had the proof to fight with. Caleb glanced at Maribel, who'd come to stand beside him, and saw in her expression the same idea already forming that was forming in his own mind. What if there was a way, Maribel said slowly, for the spring water to reach more than just our land, not given away, shared fairly, in exchange for something in return, labor, supplies, a unified front against men who've been picking off this valley one ranch at a time because nobody's ever stood together against them. Mercer's eyes sharpened with something that looked almost like the hope Caleb had felt himself, 3 days earlier, kneeling in the mud beside that first cold rush of spring water. You're talking about an alliance. I'm talking about survival, Maribel said. For all of us, not just the Hartwell Ranch, The Tarrants have been counting on this valley staying divided, every small rancher too scared and too isolated to push back. What happens if that stops being true? Caleb looked out at the darkening trenches, at the first green shoots already pushing up through soil that had been dead for 2 years, and felt the shape of something larger than himself starting to take form, something that had started with nothing more than a desperate proposal in a bean patch, and was now threatening to become the very thing that could finally bring down the family, who'd spent 2 years trying to grind this entire valley into the dust beneath their boots. "Come inside, Joseph," Caleb said. "I think we've got a lot to talk about." That night, for the second time since their wedding, the lamp in the Hartwell study burned long past midnight. But this time, it wasn't just Maribel poring over old surveys alone. It was Caleb beside her, and Joseph Mercer across the table, the three of them sketching out the rough shape of an idea that the Tarrant family hadn't seen coming and wouldn't have believed possible. A valley full of broken, desperate ranchers, finally finding a reason to stop fighting each other for scraps and start fighting together for something worth keeping. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, carrying with it the first faint smell of water finding its way back into soil that had forgotten what rain felt like. Somewhere out past the dark fields, Reginald Tarrant and his father were no doubt already plotting their next move, certain in their easy, inherited confidence that one stubborn rancher and his unlikely wife posed no real threat to everything they'd built. They had no idea what was coming. Orchestrated narrative continuation with dialogue-heavy storytelling approach. Joseph Mercer wasn't the last man to ride out to the Hartwell place that week, and he wasn't the last to sit at that kitchen table either, turning his hat over in his hands like it was the only thing keeping him steady. By the end of 7 days, 4 more ranchers had come, some openly, riding straight up the front road in daylight, and some quieter, slipping in after dark like they were ashamed to be seen asking for help, or maybe just ashamed of how close they'd all come to losing everything without anybody noticing until it was nearly too late. Caleb learned more about his neighbors in that 1 week than he had in the 2 years since his father died. He learned that Otto Reyes, who ran 60 head on the rocky ground east of Mercer's place, hadn't slept a full night in months because he kept waking up doing the arithmetic of his debt in his head. He learned that the Caldwell sisters, who'd inherited their father's spread when he passed, and had been running it themselves against the loud disapproval of half the county, had been quietly selling off jewelry and furniture just to keep their hands paid through the winter. He learned that almost every small operation in the valley was bleeding out slow, the same way his own ranch had been bleeding out slow, and that the Tarrant family had been counting, correctly, for 2 years running, on every one of them being too proud, too scared, or too isolated to ever compare notes. "They've been picking us off one at a time," Otto Reyes said one evening, sitting at the Hartwell table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, untouched. "Dam the creek a little more here. Buy out the feed store's credit there so a man can't even get grain without going through them. Spread some rumor about your stock being sick so the buyers from Dallas don't bother stopping at your gate. One thing at a time, never enough to make a man fight back outright. Just enough to wear him down till he sells cheap because he's too tired to hold on anymore." "That's exactly it," Maribel said. She'd taken to sitting at the head of the table during these conversations, a position Caleb noticed nobody questioned anymore, not even the older ranchers who probably would have bristled at a woman speaking first in any other room in the county. "And it works because none of you have ever sat down together and put the pieces side by side. Separately, it looks like bad luck. Together, it's a pattern, a deliberate one." "Pattern or not," said Walter Caldwell. No relation to the sisters, just an unfortunate shared name that had caused confusion at the post office more than once. "Knowing it's deliberate doesn't put water in my creek or money in my pocket." "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Hartwell? Because I didn't ride 2 hours in the dark to hear a speech about how unfair things are. I already know that part." Maribel didn't flinch at the bluntness, which Caleb was coming to understand was simply who she was. She met directness with more directness, never less. "I'm proposing the spring water on this land gets shared, not given away free, because charity breeds resentment faster than it breeds loyalty. And I won't ask Caleb to bankrupt himself playing savior to the whole valley." Shared, in exchange for labor and goods. You help dig the irrigation channels to extend the water where it needs to go. You help reinforce the trenches. You contribute what you can in supplies or hands, and in return, every ranch in this alliance gets guaranteed access. Not Tarrant prices, not Tarrant terms. Ours. And if the Tarrants decide to make trouble over it? Walter asked. Because they will. You know they will. They've already started, Caleb said quietly. Hollis Tarrant rode out here himself last week, offered to buy the spring parcel outright. When I said no, he made it pretty clear that no wasn't an answer he was used to accepting. That settled over the table like a weight. A few of the men exchanged glances, the kind of glance men give each other when they're each privately calculating how much they're willing to risk and trying to guess whether their neighbor is willing to risk the same. I'll be honest, Otto Reyes said slowly. I've got a wife and 3 kids who haven't had a full belly going into winter in 2 years. I'm not in a position to be brave for the sake of being brave, but I'm also not in a position to keep losing slow either. If there's a chance, even a thin one, that standing together gets us all through this instead of standing alone and watching each other get picked off, I'd rather take that chance. Same, said one of the Caldwell sisters, Ruth, the older one, with their father's stubborn jaw and none of his patience for nonsense. We've been managing on our own since Daddy passed, and folks in this town have made it real clear what they think of 2 unmarried women trying to run 60 acres without a man's name on the deed. I'm not interested in dying slow just so nobody can say I asked for help. One by one, around that table, the ranchers said yes, not with the kind of enthusiasm that made for an easy story, but with the tired, clear-eyed practicality of people who had run out of better options and were choosing to gamble on the one option that at least gave them a fighting chance instead of a slow, dignified surrender. By the time the last of them rode off into the dark that night, Caleb sat back in his chair and looked at his wife. His wife, a word that still felt strange and new in his mouth, with something that had started somewhere in the last 2 weeks to feel uncomfortably close to admiration. You did that, he said. Not me. I wouldn't have known where to start. We did that, Maribel corrected, gathering up the empty coffee cups scattered across the table. I just know how to read a ledger and ask the right questions. You're the one who's spent your whole life earning enough trust in this valley that men were willing to ride out here in the dark and listen to a stranger's wife tell them how to save their land. Don't sell yourself short, Caleb said. Not in front of me. I've heard enough of that from this town already, and I'm not interested in hearing it under my own roof, too. Something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or something gentler than surprise, before she busied herself with the cups again, the way people do when they're not quite ready to let someone see what just crossed their expression. Get some sleep, Caleb, she said instead. Tomorrow we start digging trenches, and from what Otto says, half this alliance is going to be useless with a shovel by noon if they don't rest tonight first. The digging took the better part of 3 weeks, and it was during those weeks that Caleb began to understand something about his wife that the whole rest of the valley had apparently missed entirely, blinded as they'd been by their own cruelty and their own narrow ideas about what a woman was supposed to look like to be worth anything. Maribel didn't just direct from the porch. She was out in the trenches every single day, sleeves rolled up, her dress traded for a pair of Caleb's old work trousers cinched tight at the waist, with a length of rope because she said skirts had no business anywhere near a shovel, and she worked harder than half the men out there, including some who'd spent their whole lives doing exactly this kind of labor. You don't have to keep proving something, Caleb told her one afternoon, watching her haul a load of rocky soil out of a trench, with her face streaked with dirt and sweat, her breathing hard but steady. I'm not proving anything, she said, not stopping. I'm working. There's a difference, even if this town's never been able to tell them apart when it comes to me. It was Pete, of all people. Gruff, skeptical Pete Sorensen, who'd grumbled about taking direction from a woman the very first day they'd started digging for the spring, who finally said out loud what half the men working those trenches had clearly started thinking, but hadn't found the nerve to say. Never seen anybody read land the way you do, Mrs. Hartwell, he said one evening, leaning on his shovel, watching her sketch out the next section of trench in the dirt with a stick, accounting for the slope of the land in a way that made the water flow exactly where she wanted it to flow instead of pooling uselessly or running off entirely. My own daddy worked this valley 40 years and never thought to ask half the questions you ask. Your daddy probably never had reason to, Maribel said, not looking up from her sketch. Most men around here learn to work the land the way their fathers worked it, and their fathers' fathers before that. Nobody questions a method that's always worked well enough to get by. I don't have that luxury, Pete. I came into this with nothing but a stack of old surveys and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. Turns out that's worth something when the old methods stop working the way they used to. Pete grunted, which Caleb had learned by now was about as close to a compliment as the old man ever offered anybody, and went back to digging. It wasn't just the spring that Maribel turned her sharp, restless attention to. Within a month of moving onto the Hartwell ranch, she'd reorganized the household ledgers Caleb had been keeping in a state of barely controlled chaos since his father's death, catching 3 separate errors that had been quietly bleeding money out of accounts Caleb hadn't even thought to check. She'd started a proper garden in the soil, now softened by spring water, planting not just vegetables for the table, but a small cash crop of herbs that Doc Ainsley back in town had agreed to buy regularly for his patients. A tidy little income that cost almost nothing to produce and brought in just enough extra to ease the tightness around the bank payments. And she'd introduced, over Caleb's initial and frankly bewildered skepticism, an idea about how they grazed the cattle that no rancher in the valley had ever tried before. "It's called rotational grazing," she explained one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch steps after a long day, watching the cattle move slow and content across the eastern pasture in the fading light. "I read about it in a journal Doc Ainsley had lying around. Some agricultural society back east has been experimenting with it. Instead of letting the herd graze one big pasture down to dirt and then moving them to the next, you divide the land into smaller sections and rotate the cattle through on a schedule. Gives the grass time to recover behind them instead of getting stripped bare and taking a full season to grow back." "Sounds like more fence building than I've got time or lumber for," Caleb said. "It is at first. But it means more grass overall, which means you can run more cattle on the same acreage without the land giving out on you the way it has the last 2 years. And with the spring water now reaching most of the pasture, the grass will come back faster than it would have otherwise." Caleb was quiet a moment, watching the herd move slow and unbothered in the dusk. "My father ran cattle on this land his whole life, and never once heard of anything like that. Your father never had a wife who used to spend her evenings reading agricultural journals instead of going to dances, because nobody ever asked her to dance in the first place," Maribel said, and there was something dry and a little bitter under the words, though she said them lightly enough. Caleb turned to look at her properly then, really look, the way he'd been doing more and more often over the past month without quite admitting to himself why. "Their loss," he said. "Every man in this county who never asked you to dance. Their loss, plain and simple." She glanced at him sideways, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and didn't answer right away. "You don't have to say things like that, Caleb. This is a partnership. You don't owe me flattery on top of it." "It's not flattery if it's true," Caleb said. "I've never been much good at saying things I don't mean. Ask anybody in this county. They'll tell you I'm about as smooth-talking as a fence post." That finally won a real laugh out of her. Not the careful, guarded, almost smile she'd given him in the bean patch all those weeks ago, but something looser and more genuine, the kind of laugh that made her whole face change, made Caleb's chest do something strange and unfamiliar that he didn't have a name for yet and wasn't sure he wanted to look at too closely. "No," she agreed, still smiling. "You really aren't." The rotational grazing worked, slowly at first and then undeniably, the eastern pasture greening up faster than anyone but Maribel had predicted, the cattle filling out, their coats coming in glossy in a way Caleb hadn't seen on his herd in 2 full years. Word of it traveled the way word always traveled in a county that small, first as curiosity, then as grudging interest, and within 6 weeks 2 of the Alliance ranchers had started experimenting with smaller versions of the same method on their own land, with Maribel riding out personally to walk the fence lines with them and help plan the divisions. It should have felt like nothing but good news. And for a while it did. But good news, Caleb was learning fast, had a way of drawing exactly the kind of attention a man trying to keep his head down didn't want. It started small. A section of fence on the northern boundary, torn down overnight, the posts not just knocked over but deliberately pulled and snapped, the kind of damage that didn't happen by accident or by careless cattle leaning too hard against old wood. "Could have been anybody," Pete said, examining the splintered posts the next morning, though his tone suggested he didn't believe that any more than Caleb did. Storm, maybe. Wind's been picking up lately. Wind doesn't pull fence posts clean out of the ground and leave them stacked in a pile 20 feet off, Pete. Caleb crouched by the damage, running his hand along a snapped rail. This was done by hands. Somebody wanted me to know it too, leaving it where I'd find it first thing. Maribel arrived a few minutes later, having ridden out the moment Will came back to the house to fetch her, and crouched beside the damage with the same focused, assessing look she brought to everything. Surveys, ledgers, problems of any size. "This is a message," she said quietly. "Not real damage. Not yet. If they wanted to hurt the herd, they'd have done it different. Cut the fence somewhere the cattle could wander off into the canyon, or driven them off entirely. This is them telling you they know exactly what you're doing, and they're not happy about it." "You think it's the Terrence?" "I think it's too convenient timing to be anybody else." Maribel stood, brushing dirt from her trousers. "We've had 2 ranchers join the Alliance in the last week alone. The spring's reaching further than it ever has. People are starting to notice that the Terrence stranglehold on this valley isn't quite as absolute as it used to be. That's not the kind of thing men like Hollis Tarrant let slide without some kind of response." She was right, and within days, the response escalated in ways that left no room for doubt about who was behind it or what they intended. A dozen head of Otto Reyes's cattle turned up missing one morning, the fence at his northern boundary cut clean through with wire cutters, the tracks leading off toward Tarrant land before disappearing into rocky ground too hard to hold a clear trail. 2 nights later, somebody set fire to a section of dry grass along the Caldwell sisters' eastern fence line, close enough to their barn that another 20 minutes of wind in the wrong direction could have burned the whole structure down with their horses still inside. "This isn't a warning anymore," Ruth Caldwell said, standing in the Hartwell kitchen with soot still smudged on her forearms, her usual stubborn composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "This is them trying to scare us back into line before we get too far along to stop." "It's working some," her sister Mary admitted quietly. "I won't pretend it isn't." I lay awake half the night thinking about what might have happened if that fire had caught the barn. Caleb looked around the table at the faces gathered there. Otto Reyes, jaw tight with the loss of his cattle, the Caldwell sisters still shaken from the fire, Joseph Mercer and Walter Caldwell, and 2 newer members of the Alliance who joined only in the last 2 weeks, and felt the weight of what he'd started settling heavy on his shoulders. He'd brought these people into something, asked them to take a risk alongside him, and now that risk was burning fences and stealing cattle, and threatening to take more than property if things kept escalating the way they'd been escalating. "Maybe we ought to slow down," Walter Caldwell said. "Pull back a little, let things cool off before somebody gets hurt worse than a few burned fence posts." "Pulling back is exactly what they want," Maribel said, her voice cutting through the room with a calm firmness that drew every eye toward her. "Think about it. They're not attacking us because we're weak, Walter. They're attacking us because for the first time in 2 years, we're actually becoming a problem for them, a real one. If we pull back now, we hand them exactly the victory they've been trying to force, and we do it for free, without them having to risk anything more than burning a fence line." "Easy for you to say," Walter shot back, more sharply than he probably intended. "It wasn't your barn nearly burned down with your horses inside." The room went tense and quiet, and Caleb watched his wife absorb the comment without flinching, though he saw something tighten briefly around her eyes before she answered. "You're right," she said evenly. "It wasn't, and I won't pretend to know exactly what that fear feels like, sitting in your kitchen at midnight wondering if you're going to lose everything to a fire somebody else set on purpose. But I do know what it feels like to watch people decide your worth for you before they've ever bothered to actually know you. And I know that backing down from people like the Terrence doesn't make them stop. It just teaches them that cruelty works, and they ought to keep using it." Walter didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did for a long moment. "So what do we do?" Otto Reyes finally asked. "If pulling back's off the table and just sitting here taking it clearly isn't working either?" Caleb looked at Maribel and found her already looking back at him, some unspoken agreement passing between them that he was only beginning to fully trust. "We document everything," she said. "Every torn fence, every missing animal, every fire. We get the county sheriff out here for each incident, on the record, whether he does anything about it or not. And knowing the Terrence grip on this county, I suspect he won't do much. But we build a record, a clear documented pattern of harassment and destruction tied as closely as we can tie it to Tarrant land and Tarrant men. And in the meantime, we don't stop. We keep digging the trenches. We keep building the alliance. We keep doing exactly what we've been doing, because the day we stop is the day they've already won. And if they escalate past fences and cattle, Joseph Mercer asked quietly, if next time it's not a barn that almost burns, but one that does, or worse? The question hung in the room, heavy and unwanted, and Caleb felt his jaw tighten as he answered it himself, before Maribel could. Then we'll deal with that when it comes, he said. But I'll tell you what I won't do. I won't let fear be the thing that hands this valley over to a family who spent 2 years treating every small ranch in it like something to be picked apart for profit. My father built this place with his hands, dug in when times were harder than they are now, and he never once thought about handing it over just because somebody bigger and meaner than him wanted it. I'm not about to start now, not when we finally have a real chance to stop them. Nobody argued further. One by one, the Alliance ranchers nodded, some more reluctantly than others, and the meeting broke up with a grim, determined kind of resolve settling over the group instead of the fear that had walked in the door with them an hour earlier. The sheriff, when Caleb rode into town to report the fire and the missing cattle, was about as much help as Maribel had predicted he would be. I'll note it down, Sheriff Tom Briggs said, not looking particularly inclined to do much beyond that, his boots propped on his desk in a way that suggested he had nowhere urgent to be, and no particular interest in being anywhere urgent. But I'll be straight with you, Hartwell. Without a witness who actually saw Tarrant men setting that fire or cutting that fence, there's not a whole lot I can do. Could have been drifters, could have been bad luck. County's a big place. You don't believe that any more than I do, Caleb said. Briggs's jaw worked for a moment, and something almost like discomfort crossed his face before he smoothed it back into careful neutrality. Doesn't much matter what I believe, son. Matters what I can prove, and what the county judge will actually act on. And given who funds about half this county's budget these days, he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Caleb left the sheriff's office with the bitter, familiar taste of confirmation in his mouth. Confirmation of exactly what Maribel had warned the Alliance to expect, that the law in this county bent itself around money the same way every other institution in the valley seemed to, and that whatever protection they were going to find, they'd have to build it themselves. He found Reginald Tarrant waiting for him outside, leaning against a post with the easy, unbothered posture of a man who already knew exactly how that meeting had gone before Caleb had even walked out the door. Sheriff give you the help you were hoping for? Reginald asked, not bothering to hide the amusement in his voice. You know he didn't. I imagine I do. Reginald pushed off the post, strolling closer with that same loose-limbed walk that made Caleb's hands want to curl into fists every single time he saw it. Terrible thing, fences burning down out of nowhere, cattle wandering off and getting lost. This valley's just full of bad luck lately, isn't it, Hartwell? Especially for ranchers who've started getting ideas above their station. Say what you mean, Reginald. I'm tired of the dance. Reginald's smile sharpened, the pretense of friendliness dropping away entirely. Fine. I mean this. You and your unfortunate wife have built yourselves a nice little alliance out there, getting half the small ranches in this valley to believe they've got a chance against my family. It's almost admirable in a foolish sort of way. But you ought to understand something, Hartwell, because I'd hate for more of your neighbors to suffer for your stubbornness. My family didn't get where we are by losing to men like you. We got here by being patient and by being thorough. Whatever you think you've built out there, we can dismantle it piece by piece, just as patient and just as thorough, until there's nothing left for you to lead. You set that fire. I didn't say that. Reginald's smile widened. I'd be careful making accusations you can't prove, Hartwell. Slander's an ugly thing to get tangled up in, on top of everything else you've got weighing on you these days. He walked off before Caleb could respond, leaving him standing in the street with rage burning hot and useless in his chest. The same helpless fury he'd felt outside the bank weeks ago. Except now it wasn't just his own ranch at stake. It was Otto Reyes's missing cattle and the Caldwell sisters' nearly burned barn and every other small, struggling operation that had taken a chance on an alliance because Caleb and Maribel had asked them to. He rode home slower than usual that evening, turning the conversation over and over, trying to find some angle of attack that didn't end in more burned fences or worse. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun had gone down fully, and he found Maribel waiting on the porch, a lamp burning beside her, a stack of papers in her lap that she'd clearly been working through while she waited. Sheriff was useless, he said, climbing the porch steps heavily, dropping into the chair beside her. And Reginald all but admitted to the fire, in that smug way of his where he says everything without saying anything, you could actually drag him into court over. I expected as much on both counts. Maribel didn't look surprised, though something tight and frustrated flickered across her face. I've been thinking, while you were gone, about what kind of fight actually beats a family like the Tarrants. And I don't think it's a fight we win with fences and cattle, not directly. They've got more money, more men, more patience for this kind of slow attrition than any of us do. If we try to match them blow for blow, fire for fire, theft for theft, we lose. Not because we're weaker, but because that's exactly the kind of fight they're built for, and we're not. Then what kind of fight do we win? Maribel held up the stack of papers in her lap. The same old surveys and deeds she'd been poring over since her first night in this house, except now there were new pages mixed in. Pages Caleb didn't recognize, covered in her careful, cramped handwriting. The kind that happens in courtrooms and county records, not in burned fence lines, she said. I've been going back through every transaction the Tarrant family's made in this valley over the last 2 years. Every water rights purchase, every land deal, every loan they've pushed through that bank they bought their way into controlling. Most of it's legal, infuriatingly so, but not all of it. There are at least 2 transactions here that look, on close reading, like they might violate the same territorial land grant laws that gave you the protection of marriage in the first place. Laws about water rights specifically tied to original land grants. Laws about how quickly a bank can foreclose on grant land without proper notice. Caleb leaned forward, studying the pages she held out, though half the legal language swam past him without much meaning. You think they broke the law getting some of this land? I think it's possible. I won't know for certain until I can get a proper look at the original county records, the ones filed at the Territorial Land Office, not just the copies the local bank keeps. But if I'm right... She paused, and Caleb watched something fierce and determined settle into her expression, the same look she'd worn standing over that first rush of spring water weeks ago. If I'm right, Caleb, we don't just stop the Tarrants from taking more. We might be able to take back some of what they've already taken, legally. In a way no amount of money or hired men can burn down or scare off. Caleb sat back, letting that sink in, feeling something shift inside his chest. Not quite hope. Not yet. Not after everything that had gone wrong over the past 2 years to teach him not to trust hope too quickly. But something close to it. Something that felt, for the first time since Hollis Tarrant had ridden onto his land with that false, easy smile, like maybe, just maybe, they had a real weapon to fight with, one that didn't require matching the Tarrant's cruelty inch for inch. How do we get a look at the territorial records? He asked. The land office is 2 days' ride from here, in Brennan City. Maribel was already gathering the papers into a neat stack, her mind clearly working 3 steps ahead the way it always seemed to. I'd need to go myself. Whoever requests those records needs to know exactly what they're looking for and why, or the clerks there will bury us in irrelevant paperwork for weeks, just to be unhelpful. Then we'll go together, Caleb said. I'm not sending you 2 days' ride from here alone, not with the Tarrants already showing they're willing to burn things down to keep us scared. I can take care of myself, Caleb. I know you can. He held her gaze steadily. That's not the point. The point is you shouldn't have to, not on this. We're partners. That cuts both ways. For a long moment, Maribel didn't say anything, just looked at him in the lamplight with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. Something softer than her usual careful guardedness. Something that made his chest tighten in that same unfamiliar way it had been tightening more and more often lately. All right, she said finally, quietly. Together, then. They left 2 days later, before dawn, with Pete and Will under strict instructions to keep watch over the ranch and ride for the Alliance ranchers at the first sign of trouble. The road to Brennan City wound east through country Caleb had ridden only a handful of times in his life, past ranches he didn't recognize, and a stretch of badlands that swallowed the horizon in red rock and silence. They talked more on that ride than they had in the whole month since their wedding. Not about the spring or the Alliance or the Terrence, but about smaller things. Maribel told him about Georgia, about the small farm her family had worked before fever took her parents within a week of each other 2 winters back, about the particular ache of arriving somewhere new and discovering that her size and her shape had apparently arrived with her, following her from one town to the next like something she couldn't outride no matter how far she traveled. "It's not all of this town," Caleb said carefully, somewhere on the second day, the badlands stretching red and silent around them. "There's plenty of decent people in Larkspur Hollow who've never said an unkind word about you. The loud, cruel ones just tend to be louder than the quiet, decent ones. Always have been, in every town I've ever known." "Maybe," Maribel said, "but it only takes a few loud ones to make a place feel small and unwelcoming, no matter how many quiet, decent ones there might be standing behind them, saying nothing." Caleb didn't have a good answer for that, so he didn't try to force one. He just rode beside her in the settling dusk, the two of them quiet for a long while, until Maribel spoke again, her voice softer than he'd heard it before. "You've never made me feel small," she said. "Not once, since that day in the garden. I don't think you understand what that's actually worth, coming from a man who didn't have any particular reason to be kind about it, given the circumstances we started under." "Maybe I don't understand it the way you do," Caleb admitted. "But I understand enough to know it shouldn't be rare. Treating somebody decent shouldn't be something worth remarking on, Maribel. It ought to just be the ordinary way of things." "It ought to be," she agreed. "It isn't, though. Not in my experience." "Then I guess we'll just have to be the exception," Caleb said, "until enough exceptions start adding up to something closer to ordinary." She looked at him for a long moment in the fading light, something working behind her eyes that Caleb couldn't fully name, and didn't answer. But she didn't look away either, and that, somehow, felt like answer enough. They reached Brennan City the following afternoon, dust-covered and saddle-sore, and rode straight for the Territorial Land Office before either of them had so much as washed the road off their faces. Because whatever waited in those records, for good or ill, neither one of them could stand to wait another night to find out. The Territorial Land Office in Brennan City was a squat brick building that looked like it had been built to discourage exactly the kind of digging Maribel had come to do, with narrow windows and a clerk's counter positioned just far enough back into the gloom that a person had to squint to make out the face behind it. The clerk himself, a thin, balding man named Aldous Penny, looked up from his ledger with the particular weariness of someone who had spent 30 years answering the same handful of questions from people who never seemed to understand the answers the first time. "Help you?" he asked, not standing. "We need to see the original land grant filings for Larkspur Hollow and the surrounding valley," Maribel said, already pulling a folded paper from her bag. A list she'd written out the night before they left, every parcel number and grant date she could recall from Caleb's father's surveys. Specifically, anything filed or transferred in the last 2 years involving water rights along Cottonwood Creek. Penny's eyebrows went up slightly, the first real interest he'd shown since they walked in. "That's a fair amount of paper, ma'am. Mind if I ask what for?" "We have reason to believe certain transactions may have violated the original grant conditions," Maribel said, her voice level and businesslike in a way that made Caleb, standing slightly behind her, feel a flicker of pride he hadn't expected to feel watching his wife talk to a county clerk. "We'd like to verify that ourselves before taking the matter any further." Penny studied her for a long moment, then glanced at Caleb, then back to Maribel, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite sympathy, but something close to it. The look of a man who'd been quietly watching something happen in his county for 2 years and hadn't had the standing to say a word about it. "Terrence," he said. It wasn't a question. "We didn't say that," Caleb said carefully. "Didn't need to." Penny stood, finally, and reached for a ring of keys hanging beside the counter. "I've filed more paper for that family in the last 2 years than I filed for the whole rest of this county, combined. Some of it I didn't love putting my signature to, if I'm being honest, but it's not my place to refuse a filing just because I don't care for the man making it." He paused at the door to the back room, looking at them both with something almost like an apology in his expression. "Give me an hour. I'll pull what you're asking for. And Mrs. Hartwell, for what it's worth, I hope you find what you're looking for." It took closer to 2 hours, the two of them sitting on a hard wooden bench in the front room, while the afternoon light slid slow across the floor, before Penny emerged with a stack of files thick enough that he had to carry them in both arms. "This is everything filed under the Tarrant name for water rights and land transfers in your valley, going back 3 years," he said, setting the stack down on the counter with a thud. "I'll need to keep it on premises, but you're welcome to go through it here as long as you need. I close at 6, but I don't mind staying later if you're close to finding what you need." Maribel was already pulling the first file toward her before he'd finished talking, her hands moving with the same brisk, focused efficiency Caleb had watched her bring to his father's old ledgers that first night in his study. He pulled up a chair beside her, not entirely sure what use he'd be in sorting through legal language he barely understood, but unwilling to sit idle while she worked through what might be the only real weapon they had. The first hour turned up nothing but confirmation of what they already knew. The Tarrants had bought up water rights along Cottonwood Creek parcel by parcel, each transaction technically legal on its face, each seller apparently willing, at least on paper, though Caleb knew well enough how much pressure could sit behind a signature that looked willing from the outside. It was deep into the second hour, the light through the narrow windows turning gold and then orange, when Maribel went very still over a file marked with a date 18 months back, her finger tracing down a page of dense legal text with an intensity that made Caleb lean in close beside her. "What is it?" "This." She tapped the page, her voice tight with something that might have been excitement or might have been fury. Caleb couldn't quite tell which. "This is the original grant filing for the Meeker parcel, the land directly upstream of Cottonwood Creek, the section the Tarrants used to build their first dam. Look at the grant conditions, right here." Caleb leaned in, squinting at the cramped legal handwriting. "I can't make heads or tails of this. It says the grant is conditioned on the land remaining in continuous agricultural use by the original grantee family or their direct heirs for no less than 50 years from the date of issue, or the grant reverts to territorial control and becomes available for new allocation. The Meeker grant was issued 61 years ago, which means the 50-year condition was satisfied. But look here." She flipped to a second page, a transfer record. The Tarrants didn't buy this from a Meeker heir. They bought it from a land speculation company in Dallas, who bought it 8 months earlier from a man named Silas Pruitt, who has no recorded relation to the Meeker family at all. "Pruitt," Caleb repeated slowly. "Any relation to Otis at the bank?" "I don't know yet, but it gets worse." Maribel pulled out another document, this one a county tax record. There's no record of this Silas Pruitt ever paying taxes on the Meeker parcel, ever living on it, ever working it in any capacity. He held it for exactly 4 months before selling it to the Dallas company, who held it for exactly 8 months before selling to the Tarrants. That's not a family inheriting land and choosing to sell it, Caleb. That's a paper trail built to disguise something. Disguise what? Maribel sat back, her eyes bright with the particular fierce satisfaction of someone who had just found the loose thread that, pulled hard enough, might unravel an entire garment. "I think the actual Meeker heirs never sold this land at all. I think somebody forged a transfer, probably while the original family was distracted or vulnerable somehow, and ran it through 2 shell sales fast enough that nobody would think to look too close by the time it landed in Tarrant hands. And if that's true, the original grant conditions never lapsed properly. Which means the Tarrants' claim to that water, the dam, the diversion, all of it, might be built on land they never legally owned in the first place." Caleb sat back hard in his chair, the implications of that settling slow and heavy across his chest. "If that's true, that's not just a property dispute, that's fraud." "That's fraud," Maribel agreed. "And fraud tied to a forged transfer is exactly the kind of thing that gets a man's entire empire dragged into court, Tarrant money or not. Judges might bend for influence on a close call, Caleb, but outright forgery tied to a land grant violation, that's not a close call. That's the kind of thing that ends careers and empires both, if it can be proven." "Can it be proven?" Maribel's excitement dimmed slightly, replaced by the careful caution of someone who understood the difference between a strong theory and an airtight case. not with what's in this file alone. We'd need to find the actual Meeker heirs, if any are still living, and find out whether they ever signed anything at all, or whether this Silas Pruitt forged the transfer outright. We'd need a handwriting expert, probably, and a lawyer with the spine to take this on against the Tarrant family's money. None of that's going to be easy or fast. But it's possible. It's possible, she said, and something in her voice, tired now, the long hours of the day catching up with her, but underneath the exhaustion still that same fierce, unbroken determination, made Caleb feel something settle and steady in his own chest. And right now, Caleb, possible is more than we had riding into this town 2 days ago. Aldous Penny stayed past closing to help them copy out the relevant documents by hand, working in careful silence at the counter while Maribel dictated and Caleb wrote, his penmanship rougher than hers but steady enough to get the job done. By the time they finished, full dark had settled over Brennan City, and Penny was rubbing his eyes with the particular weariness of a long day stretched longer than expected. "I'd be careful who you show those to before you're ready," he said, gathering up the original files to return them to the back room. "Word travels fast in this territory when it comes to land disputes, and the Tarrant family's got ears in more places than just their own valley, from what I understand." "We'll be careful," Caleb said. "And Mr. Penny? Thank you. You didn't have to help us the way you did." Penny paused at the door, something tired and a little sad crossing his face. "I've watched that family buy their way through 3 counties now, Mr. Hartwell. Watched good people get squeezed out of land their families worked for generations and never had the standing to do a thing about it but file the paperwork and feel sick about it after. If there's even a chance somebody finally holds them to account, I'm glad to have played some small part in it. Go home safe, the both of you." The ride back to Larkspur Hollow felt different than the ride out had. Lighter in some ways, heavier in others. The weight of what they'd found pressing against the both of them, even as the shape of a real plan started to take form between them with every mile. "We need a lawyer," Maribel said, somewhere on the second day of the ride home, the Badlands stretching red and quiet around them, same as before. "Someone willing to take on the Tarrant family directly, which I suspect narrows the field considerably in this territory." "There's a man in Brennan City Penny mentioned before we left," Caleb said. "Name of Wallace Tate. Penny said he'd handled a land dispute against a railroad company a few years back and won, which apparently makes him either very brave or very foolish, depending who you ask." "Maybe a little of both," Maribel said. "Might be exactly the kind of man we need." They reached the ranch on the evening of the 3rd day to find Pete waiting on the porch with an expression that told Caleb something had gone wrong before the old man had said a single word. "Terrence came by while you were gone," Pete said without preamble. 3 of them, with 2 hired men besides. Didn't do nothing to the property, not directly. Just rode the fence line slow, looking things over, like they were taking stock of something. Hollis Tarrant himself stopped by the gate, asked when you'd be back. I told him I didn't rightly know, which was true enough at the time." "Did he say anything else?" Maribel asked. "Said to tell you he hopes your trip was productive." Pete's weathered face creased with something like worry. "Didn't like the way he said it, Caleb. Like he already knew exactly where you'd gone and exactly what you'd been looking for." Caleb exchanged a look with Maribel, the same uneasy thought passing between them without either having to say it aloud, that somehow word of their trip to the land office had already reached Tarrant ears, faster than seemed possible, for a 2-day ride in either direction. "Penny," Maribel said quietly, "or someone at the office. Somebody talked. Or somebody followed us," Caleb said. "Either way, they know we're digging into something. The question now is how much they know and how fast we need to move before they decide to do something about it beyond riding the fence line and looking ominous." They didn't have to wait long to find out the answer to that question. It was Walter Caldwell who came at first light 3 days later, his horse lathered from a hard ride, his face white and grim in a way that made Caleb's stomach drop before the man had even dismounted. "Otto Reyes's barn burned last night," Walter said, swinging down from his saddle without bothering to tie off the reins properly. "Whole structure, gone. He lost feed, tools, 2 horses that couldn't get out in time. Family's safe, thank goodness, but it's bad, Caleb. It's real bad." Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. the particular helpless rage of watching consequences fall on someone else because of a fight he'd asked them to join. Was anyone hurt trying to get the horses out? Otto's got burns on both hands, nothing that won't heal, but bad enough he can't work for a spell. Walter's jaw was tight. And here's the thing, Caleb. This wasn't subtle. Not like the fence cutting or the first fire near the Caldwell place. Whoever did this wanted it seen, left tracks leading straight toward Tarrant Land, didn't even bother covering them proper, like they're not even pretending anymore that they might get caught. Because they don't think anybody's going to make them answer for it, Maribel said grimly, coming out onto the porch with her arms crossed against the morning chill. The sheriff's already shown he won't act without proof he can't get. They're escalating because escalating's worked so far, and they've got no reason yet to believe it'll stop working. Then we give him reason, Caleb said. By midday, every member of the Alliance had gathered at the Hartwell Ranch, a tense, frightened, angry group standing in the yard while Otto Reyes sat on a borrowed chair with his bandaged hands resting carefully in his lap, his wife standing protective and exhausted beside him, their 3 children clustered close, too young to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to know something was deeply wrong. I won't lie to any of you, Caleb said, standing before the group with Maribel beside him. This has gotten more dangerous than I think any of us expected when we first started this alliance. Otto's barn is gone, his hands are burned, and I take responsibility for that because I'm the one who asked all of you to stand together against a family with more money and more patience for cruelty than any of us individually could match. Wasn't your hand that struck the match? Otto said quietly, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion, but steady underneath it. Don't go taking blame that ain't yours to take, Hartwell. I made my own choice joining this alliance, same as everybody else standing here. I'd make it again too, even knowing what it cost me, because the alternative was watching my family starve slow on dried-up land while the Tarrants got richer off our suffering. At least this way, somebody's finally fighting back. A murmur of agreement moved through the gathered group, more determined than Caleb had expected given the circumstances. We found something in Brennan City, Maribel said, raising her voice enough to carry across the yard. Evidence that suggests the Tarrant family's claim to the water rights along Cottonwood Creek, the same rights they've used to slowly strangle every small ranch in this valley for 2 years, may be built on a forged land transfer. If we're right, and if we can prove it, it's not just enough to stop them from taking more. It could be enough to take back what they've already taken, legally, in a way no fire or stolen cattle can undo. The yard went quiet, every face turning toward her with a mixture of hope and disbelief. How sure are you? Ruth Caldwell asked. Sure enough to pursue it, Maribel said honestly. Not sure enough to promise it'll work. We need a lawyer willing to take this on, and we need to track down the actual Meeker family heirs, if any are still living, to find out whether they ever willingly sold that land at all. It won't be fast, and it won't be easy, especially fighting a family with the kind of money and influence the Tarrants have built up in this territory. But it's a real chance, Joseph Mercer said slowly. Better than just sitting here waiting for our barns to burn one at a time. It's a real chance, Caleb agreed. But I won't pretend the next stretch isn't going to be hard, or that it won't ask more of all of you than digging trenches and sharing water did. If any of you want to step back now, nobody here is going to think less of you for it. You've got families to protect, same as Otto does. The yard was silent for a long moment, the only sound the wind moving through the dry grass, and one of Otto's children crying softly, exhausted and frightened in his mother's arms. It was Mary Caldwell, the quieter of the 2 sisters, who finally broke the silence. My sister and I have spent 2 years watching this valley die slow, piece by piece, while men like the Tarrants got fat off the dying, she said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. I'd rather take a real risk fighting back than keep dying slow and safe. I'm staying in this fight. One by one, around the yard, the others echoed her, some with more confidence than others, some clearly frightened but unwilling to let that fear be the thing that finally broke them. By the time the meeting ended, the alliance stood unbroken, even battered, even afraid, more determined than they'd been before the barn burned. Caleb watched them ride off in 2s and 3s, back toward their own threatened land, and felt the full weight of what he'd built settle hard and permanent across his shoulders. They could have walked away, he said quietly, once the yard had emptied. After everything that's happened, they could have walked away, and nobody would have blamed them for it. They could have, Maribel agreed, standing close beside him in the settling dust. But they didn't. That ought to tell you something, Caleb. About them, and about what you and I have built out here, whether either of us fully meant to build it or not. Wallace Tate arrived from Brennan City 8 days later, a tall, rail-thin man with sharp eyes and a perpetually rumpled coat, carrying a leather satchel stuffed with papers and an energy that suggested he'd been waiting his entire career for exactly this kind of fight to walk through his door. Aldous Penny sent word about what you found, Tate said, settling into a chair at the Hartwell kitchen table, pulling papers from his satchel with quick, efficient movements. I'll be honest with you both. I've wanted to put the Tarrant family in front of a judge for 2 years now, watched them squeeze 3 different clients of mine out of land and livelihood, and never had enough solid ground to stand on to actually do anything about it. If what you found is real, this might finally be solid enough ground. What do you need from us? Maribel asked. First, I need to see everything you copied at the land office. Tate spent the better part of an hour going through the documents Maribel had so carefully transcribed, his expression growing sharper and more focused with every page. This is good work, Mrs. Hartwell. Better than good. You've got a real eye for this kind of thing. I've had practice reading numbers nobody else bothered to look at closely, Maribel said. Well, it shows. Tate set the papers down, looking between the two of them with the serious, calculating expression of a man already building his case in his head. Here's what I need next, and it's not going to be easy. We need to find any living Meeker heirs and get a sworn statement, ideally in front of a judge or notary, confirming whether or not they ever sold this parcel. If they say no, and we can show this Silas Pruitt forged the transfer, we have grounds not just to challenge the Tarrant family's claim to the water rights, but potentially to open a fraud investigation that could unravel a great deal more of their holdings in this valley, if a pattern emerges. Do you know where to find the Meeker family? Caleb asked. Not yet, but county birth and death records will give us a starting point, and from what I understand, finding people is half of what makes a good lawyer worth his fee. Tate allowed himself a small, grim smile. I'll start digging today. In the meantime, I'd encourage you both to be careful. If the Tarrant family already suspects what you're after, and from what you've told me about their behavior since your trip to Brennan City, I'd guess they do. They're not going to sit idle waiting to see whether you succeed. That warning proved prophetic faster than any of them wanted. 2 weeks into Tate's search for the Meeker heirs, a search that had turned up a faint trail leading toward a small settlement nearly 100 miles south, where county records suggested a surviving Meeker daughter might have relocated after her father's death. The Tarrant family's patience finally ran out entirely. It happened on a night with no moon, the kind of dark that made even familiar land feel strange and unfriendly. Caleb woke to the sound of cattle bawling in a register that meant something more than ordinary nighttime restlessness, and by the time he'd pulled on his boots and grabbed his rifle from beside the bed, Maribel was already awake beside him, her face pale in the darkness. Something's wrong, she said, already reaching for her own boots. Outside, the night was chaos, cattle stampeding blind and panicked through the eastern pasture. The rotational grazing fences Maribel had so carefully built over the past months trampled flat under the weight of 200 frightened animals running from something. Caleb caught sight of riders in the distance, 3 or 4 of them, hazing the herd deliberately toward the rocky drop-off at the canyon's edge. The same canyon where a stampeding herd could break legs and necks by the dozen if they ran far enough in blind panic. "They're driving them toward the canyon," Caleb shouted, already swinging up onto his horse, Pete and Will scrambling out of the bunkhouse behind him, half-dressed and grabbing for whatever they could find to help turn the herd. What followed was the longest, most desperate hour of Caleb's life, riding hard through darkness thick enough to hide a man's hand in front of his face, trying to turn 200 panicked cattle away from a drop that would have killed dozens of them, and likely a few riders besides, while somewhere in that same darkness, hired men worked deliberately to keep the herd running the wrong direction. It was Maribel, of all of them, who found the gap, riding hard along the herd's flank with a lantern held high despite the danger of doing so, using the light to turn the leading cattle just enough, just in time, the herd splitting and curving away from the canyon edge with barely 30 yards to spare. thundering instead into the wide, empty pasture to the north, where they finally began to slow, exhausted and confused, but alive. Caleb found her afterward, sitting on her horse at the pasture's edge, breathing hard, her lantern guttering low. The first gray light of dawn just beginning to show along the eastern ridge. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with a fear he hadn't let himself feel until the danger had passed. "Riding that close to a stampede in the dark, with a lantern making you an easy target besides." "I know," Maribel said, and he could hear in her voice that the fear was only now catching up with her too, her hands visibly trembling on the reins. "I didn't think about it until just now, if I'm honest. I just saw the canyon edge and knew somebody had to turn them, and there wasn't time to think past that." Caleb reached over, covering her trembling hand with his own, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, just sat there in the thin gray dawn light, breathing hard, alive, the herd settling into uneasy quiet around them. "We lost some," Pete reported grimly when they finally made it back to the house, Will limping slightly from where his horse had stumbled in the dark. 11 head, best I can count so far in this light. Few more with broken legs we'll have to put down. Could have been a whole lot worse, though, and that's down to Mrs. Hartwell's quick thinking out there." 11 head, Caleb repeated, the number settling heavy and bitter in his chest. 11 animals, dead or dying, on top of Otto Reyes's burned barn and stolen cattle, on top of every other small cruelty the Tarrant family had inflicted across the valley over the past weeks. This isn't a warning anymore. This is them trying to break us entirely. "Then they're about to learn something," Maribel said, her voice steady again now, the trembling gone, replaced by something hard and determined that Caleb was coming to recognize as the truest version of his wife, the one that emerged not in comfort, but in crisis. "They're about to learn that breaking us is going to cost them a great deal more than they think it will." By that afternoon, word had spread through the entire alliance about the stampede, and what should have been a moment of fear and retreat instead became something else entirely. A turning point. The moment when every rancher in that loose, frightened coalition stopped seeing the fight against the Tarrant family as Caleb and Maribel's fight that they'd agreed to help with, and started seeing it as their own fight, shared and equal and necessary. "They came at your herd with riders in the dark," Otto Reyes said, standing in the Hartwell yard with his bandaged hands still wrapped, but his voice fierce, despite the pain clearly still etched across his face. "Burned my barn, cut Mercer's fence, stole my cattle. There's no more pretending this is anything but war, Hartwell, whether we wanted that word attached to it or not." "No," Caleb agreed grimly. "I suppose there isn't." "Then let's stop fighting it like we're still hoping they'll show some kind of restraint," Ruth Caldwell said, her jaw set the same stubborn way her late father's used to set, according to everyone who'd known him. "Let's fight it like we mean to win." Maribel stepped forward, then, something resolved and almost calm settling over her despite the exhaustion still etched plain across her face from the long night before. "Wallace Tate believes he's found a lead on the Meeker family, a surviving daughter, possibly, 100 miles south. If we can get to her before the Tarrants realize what we're chasing, and if she confirms what we believe about that forged transfer, we won't need to win this fight with fences and fire at all. We'll win it in a courtroom in front of a judge, with the full weight of territorial law behind us instead of against us." "And if she's already dead, or gone, or won't talk?" Walter Caldwell asked, though his earlier hesitancy had clearly burned away somewhere in the smoke of Otto's barn and the chaos of the stampede. "Then we keep digging until we find another way," Maribel said simply. "Because I'll tell you what I've learned about men like Hollis and Reginald Tarrant in the short time I've had the misfortune of dealing with them directly. They've built their whole empire on the assumption that nobody in this valley has the patience, the resources, or the nerve to actually fight back properly. Every fire they set, every fence they cut, every stampede they cause, it's all built on that same assumption. The day that assumption stops being true is the day they start losing, whether they realize it yet or not." Caleb looked around at the alliance gathered in his yard, battered, frightened, exhausted, and yet somehow more unified than they'd been even before the violence started, bound together now not just by shared interest, but by shared loss, shared danger, shared determination to see this through to whatever end was waiting for them. Then we ride south, he said. All of us, or as many as can be spared from watching what's left of our herds and our homes. Wallace Tate's going to need help tracking down this woman, and I'd rather have eyes and hands he can trust at his back than send him chasing this lead alone, not with how far the Tarrants have already shown they're willing to go. Nobody argued. By the next morning, Caleb, Maribel, and Wallace Tate were on the road south. Pete and the Alliance left behind to guard what remained of their scattered, battered holdings, all of them carrying the same fragile, dangerous hope that somewhere 100 miles down a dusty southern road, a woman named Meeker was waiting with the one piece of truth that could finally bring the whole rotten foundation of the Tarrant Empire crashing down around their ears. The settlement was called Dry Fork, and it lived up to its name in every way that mattered, a scattering of buildings clinging to a riverbed that hadn't held real water in years, the kind of place people ended up rather than chose. It took them 4 days to find it, 4 days of riding south through country that grew progressively more barren, Wallace Tate consulting a stack of county records at every stop, asking after the name Meeker, in towns so small they barely warranted the name. They found the thread in a settlement 2 days out. An old shopkeeper who remembered a woman matching the description recalled she'd married a farmer and moved further south to Dry Fork some 6 years back. "You're sure this is the right family?" Caleb asked, the three of them sitting their horses at the edge of Dry Fork's single dusty street, the late afternoon sun throwing long shadows across buildings that looked like they might give up and collapse if the wind picked up too hard. "I'm sure of nothing until we talk to her," Tate said. "But the timeline fits. Father deceased, only surviving child a daughter, moved away from the original homestead around the time the parcel transfer would have happened. If this is the right woman, she'll either confirm what we suspect or she won't, and either way we'll finally know something solid instead of guessing." They found her at the edge of town, in a small house with a vegetable garden out front that looked considerably better tended than the rest of Dry Fork's struggling attempts at agriculture. A woman in her middle 30s answered the door, wary and tired-looking in the particular way of someone who'd learned not to expect good news from strangers showing up at her doorstep. "Mrs. Holt?" Tate asked, removing his hat. "Formerly Meeker, before your marriage?" The woman's face went carefully blank, the same kind of guardedness Caleb recognized from Maribel's expression in those first weeks of their marriage. The look of someone who'd had reason to be cautious before and never quite unlearned it. "Who's asking?" "My name's Wallace Tate. I'm a lawyer out of Brennan City. This is Caleb and Maribel Hartwell, ranchers from Larkspur Hollow, about 100 miles north of here. We need to ask you about a parcel of land your father held, north along Cottonwood Creek. We have reason to believe it may have been fraudulently transferred after his death." Something flickered across the woman's face. Not surprise, Caleb realized, but something closer to a long-buried fear finally surfacing after years of being pushed down. "You'd better come in," she said quietly. "And you'd better tell me exactly who sent you, because I haven't talked about that land in 6 years, and I never expected anybody to come asking." Her name was Eleanor Holt, and the story she told them over the next hour, sitting at a worn kitchen table with her hands wrapped tight around a cup of coffee she never drank, confirmed everything Maribel had suspected, and a good deal more besides. "My father died of a fever," Eleanor said, her voice steady but carrying the particular flatness of someone reciting something painful enough that distance was the only way to get through it. "Sudden, hard, gone within a week. I was 22, alone. No other family left to speak of. There was a man who came around not 2 weeks after the funeral, before I'd even finished going through Daddy's papers. Said his name was Silas Pruitt. Said he'd heard about my situation, knew I was alone and likely overwhelmed, and offered to help me settle the estate quick and clean so I could move on with my life without the burden of property I couldn't work alone." "Did you sell him the land?" Tate asked gently. "I never sold him anything." Eleanor's hands tightened around her cup. "I told him I needed time to think, that I wasn't ready to make any decisions that fast, not with my father barely in the ground. He left polite enough, and I thought that was the end of it. 2 months later, I married my husband and we moved south, looking for a fresh start somewhere the memories weren't so thick. I never went back to settle the property formal because I figured it'd just sit there mine, until I worked up the strength to deal with it proper. And you never signed anything? Maribel said carefully. Transferring ownership to Mr. Pruitt or to anyone else? Never signed a single thing. Eleanor looked between the three of them, something fierce and frightened mixing together in her expression. Are you telling me somebody's been using that land all this time? Telling me it's been sold, transferred, whatever you said, without my signature anywhere on it? We believe so, Tate said. Mrs. Holt, I know this is a great deal to take in at once, but I need to ask, would you be willing to provide a sworn statement confirming what you've just told us? In front of a judge, formally, with your signature attached? It could be vital to a legal case against the family who currently holds that land. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between the three faces watching her, weighing something Caleb couldn't fully guess at. That land got my father killed, in a way, she said finally, quietly. Not directly, but he worked himself sick trying to keep it productive those last few years. Drought same as you're probably dealing with now, I'd guess. I left it behind because I didn't want anything more to do with the grief tied up in it. But if somebody forged my name to steal it out from under me, and if that same somebody's been hurting other families the way you're describing, she looked up, something resolved settling into her face. Yes, I'll give you my statement, whatever it takes to make this right. Man, the ride back north felt different than any of the journeys before it. Eleanor Holt's sworn statement carefully folded and sealed in Tate's satchel, a document that the lawyer kept checking on with the nervous frequency of a man guarding something far more valuable than paper had any right to be. This is enough, Tate said on their second night camped along the trail, the fire throwing restless shadows across his face as he reviewed his notes for what must have been the 10th time that day. Combined with the land office records, combined with the absence of any genuine sale documentation, this is enough to file. A forged transfer, confirmed by sworn testimony from the actual heir. We can have a judge looking at this within 2 weeks of getting back to Brennan City. And if the Tarrants find out before then, Caleb asked, watching the fire, his mind still turning over the burned barn and the stampede and every other escalation that had marked the weeks since their first trip to the land office. They very well might, Tate admitted. Land disputes this size don't stay quiet long, especially once we start serving notice. My advice, and I'd urge you both to take it seriously, is that we move as fast as the law allows once we're back. The sooner this is in front of a judge, the sooner it stops being something the Tarrant family can intimidate or burn its way out of, and starts being something only a court can resolve. Maribel had been quiet through most of the exchange, staring into the fire with an expression Caleb had come to recognize as her thinking face, the same look she wore poring over old surveys late into the night. There's something else we should consider, she said slowly. Once this becomes public, once the Alliance ranchers know we have real grounds to challenge the Tarrants in court, it changes the nature of the fight. Right now, they're attacking us because they think they can scare us into backing down quietly. But a courtroom fight is public. It's permanent record. If we time this right, we don't just file a lawsuit. We make sure every small rancher in this valley, every merchant, every family who's ever been quietly squeezed by Tarrant money knows exactly what's coming and exactly why. You're talking about building public pressure, Tate said, studying her with new interest. Making sure the Tarrants can't quietly settle this with the Meeker family alone and bury the rest of it. I'm talking about making sure that whatever happens to the Meeker parcel, the larger pattern doesn't get buried with it, Maribel said. If they forged one transfer, I doubt very much it's the only one. We've already found one suspicious chain of ownership. I'd wager there are others, if anyone bothers to look as closely as we looked at this one. Caleb watched his wife across the firelight, the same fierce, focused determination he'd watched build in her since that very first night in his father's study, and felt something he could no longer pretend not to recognize settling deep and certain in his chest. He had married this woman out of desperation, out of nothing more than a need for a legal loophole, and 6 weeks standing between him and ruin. Somewhere in the months since, without either of them quite marking the exact moment it happened, that desperate arrangement had become something else entirely. A partnership built on something sturdier than convenience, and a feeling in Caleb's chest that had stopped being unfamiliar weeks ago and had simply become quietly and without fanfare, the truest thing he felt most days. He hadn't said anything about it, wasn't sure yet how to say it, or whether she'd want to hear it, given everything their marriage had started as. But sitting there by the fire, watching her plan out a strategy that could topple an empire built on cruelty and forged paper, he thought, not for the first time, that he had gotten far more out of that desperate proposal in the bean patch than he'd ever had any right to expect. They rode back into Larkspur Hollow 8 days after they'd left, dust-covered and saddle-weary, to find the Alliance waiting with news that made Caleb's stomach drop the moment he saw the grim set of Pete's face. "Terrence made a move while you were gone," Pete said without preamble, meeting them at the edge of town where word had apparently spread fast enough for half the Alliance to gather. "Pushed a foreclosure notice through on Mercer's place. Claims he's behind on a loan he says he never took out. Some paper with his signature on it that Mercer swears he never signed." Joseph Mercer himself stood among the gathered group, his face pale and furious in equal measure. "I've never borrowed a dime from that bank in my life, Hartwell. Never needed to until the creek dried up the last 2 years. But there's a note with my name on it, dated 8 months back, says I owe $1,200 I never saw a cent of." "Forged," Maribel said immediately, something cold and certain in her voice. "Same as the Meeker transfer. They're not even bothering to be subtle about their methods anymore." "We found her," Caleb told the gathered group. "Eleanor Holt. Confirmed she never sold that parcel, never signed a single document transferring it. Tate's got her sworn statement, and combined with what we copied from the land office, we've got enough to file against the Tarrant family for fraud." A ripple of cautious hope moved through the gathered ranchers, but Wallace Tate held up a hand before it could build too far. "I won't pretend this solves everything overnight. Filing the case is the easy part. Proving it in front of a judge, especially a judge in a county where the Tarrant family's influence runs deep, is going to take time and careful work. And from what I'm hearing about this forged note against Mr. Mercer, it sounds like they're not waiting around to see whether our case succeeds. They're escalating their own attacks in the meantime, hoping to bury us in enough separate crises that we can't focus on the one fight that actually threatens them." "Then we fight both at once," Maribel said. "Mercer's forged note and the Meeker case together. If they're forging documents against one of us, the pattern only strengthens our argument that they forged the Meeker transfer too. It's not two separate problems, Wallace. It's the same problem, wearing two different faces." Tate considered that, then nodded slowly. "You may be right. A demonstrated pattern of forgery is far more compelling to a judge than a single isolated incident, however strong the evidence behind it. I'll need everything you can gather on this note against Mr. Mercer, when it supposedly originated, who witnessed the signing, anything that doesn't add up." "Nothing about it adds up," Mercer said bitterly. "That's the whole problem." The weeks that followed were the hardest of the entire fight, a grinding, exhausting stretch where the war between the Hartwell Alliance and the Tarrant Empire fought itself out on two fronts simultaneously. In the careful, slow machinery of the territorial court system, where Wallace Tate filed motion after motion, gathered affidavit after affidavit, building the fraud case piece by careful piece, and in the much rawer, more immediate violence of the valley itself, where the Tarrant family's hired men grew bolder with every week that passed without consequence. Another fence came down on the Caldwell property, this one accompanied by a dozen head of cattle driven clean off the land and never recovered. A wagon carrying Alliance supplies between ranches was ambushed on a lonely stretch of road, the driver beaten badly enough that he spent a week unable to work, though he survived and would, eventually, heal. And one terrible night, 3 weeks into the legal proceedings, somebody set fire to the Hartwell barn itself. Not the house, not yet, but close enough that Caleb spent that whole desperate night hauling water from the spring alongside Pete and Will and half the Alliance, who'd ridden through the darkness the moment word reached them, to keep the flames from spreading to the house where Maribel had stayed behind, coughing through smoke, helping carry what livestock and supplies they could save out into the safety of the open yard. They saved the house, lost the barn entirely, along with a season's worth of stored feed and most of the tools Caleb's father had spent decades collecting. "This has to end," Caleb said the next morning, standing in the smoking ruin of the barn with soot still streaked across his face, exhaustion sitting heavy and bitter behind his eyes. "Tate's case is moving too slow. They're going to burn this whole valley down around us before a judge ever hears a word of it. It's moving as fast as the law allows, Maribel said, though her voice carried the same exhausted frustration Caleb felt in his own chest. She stood beside him in the wreckage, her hands wrapped where a falling beam had scraped them raw the night before, her hair still smelling of smoke. I know it doesn't feel fast enough. It isn't fast enough. But burning down faster than the law can move is exactly what they're counting on, Caleb. If we let that frustration push us into doing something rash, something that gives them grounds to paint us as the lawless ones, instead of them, we lose everything we've built toward. Then what do we do? Just keep losing barns and cattle and watching our neighbors get beaten on lonely roads, waiting on a court system that moves slower than a wounded mule? Something in his voice must have carried more raw despair than he intended, because Maribel's expression softened, and she reached up to touch his soot-streaked face gently, an unexpected tenderness that cut through his exhaustion more than any argument could have. "We hold on," she said quietly. "Same as we've been holding on since the day you rode out to that bean patch and asked a stranger to marry you out of pure desperation. We hold on, and we trust the work we've put in, and we don't let them break us into giving up the one advantage we actually have over them, which is that we're right, Caleb. And eventually, in a courtroom that actually has to look at evidence instead of just listening to whoever has the most money, being right matters." Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch, feeling some of the raw panic of the night before finally start to settle into something steadier. "I keep thinking about what happens if I'm wrong to keep dragging everybody through this. Otto's hands, the wagon driver beaten half to death. Now this." He gestured at the smoking ruin around them. "What if holding on costs somebody their life before this is over, Maribel? I don't know if I could live with that." "None of us know what it might cost," Maribel said honestly. "I won't pretend otherwise, not to you, but I know what it costs to back down too. And that's everything eventually, just slower and quieter than fire. At least this way, whatever happens, we're choosing to fight for something instead of just waiting to lose it." The break, when it finally came, arrived from a direction none of them had fully anticipated. Aldous Penny, the land office clerk who'd helped them in Brennan City, sent word through Wallace Tate 3 weeks after the barn fire. A careful, cautious letter explaining that he'd been doing some quiet digging of his own in the weeks since their visit, troubled enough by what he'd seen that he couldn't simply let it sit. He'd found 2 more transactions bearing the same suspicious pattern as the Meeker parcel. Land bought from sellers who, on closer investigation, appeared to have no clear connection to the original Grant families, transferred through the same Dallas speculation company before landing, eventually, in Tarrant hands. 3 parcels now, Tate said, spreading the documents across the Hartwell kitchen table, his usual rumpled energy sharpened into something closer to barely contained excitement. 3 separate transfers, all bearing the same fingerprints. A stranger approaching a vulnerable heir shortly after a death in the family, a fast, quiet transaction, and then a shell sale through the same Dallas company before the land lands with the Tarrants. This isn't one isolated forgery anymore. This is a documented pattern of systematic fraud. "Can you prove the other 2 are forgeries the same way you're proving the Meeker one?" Caleb asked. "I'm working on tracking down the other heirs now," Tate said. "But even without that, Penny's research alone establishes a pattern troubling enough that I believe, and I want to be careful here because I don't make promises about courtrooms lightly. I believe we have grounds not just for a civil case about land ownership, but for a formal fraud investigation that could put both Hollis and Reginald Tarrant in front of a criminal court, not just a civil one." The weight of that statement settled slow and heavy over the kitchen table. "Criminal," Maribel repeated, "not just losing the land. Actual consequences. If the pattern holds, and if we can prove intent, which a documented pattern across multiple transactions makes considerably easier to argue than a single isolated incident, yes. This stops being a dispute they can buy their way out of with a settlement and an apology. This becomes something that could end the Tarrant family's entire operation in this territory." Caleb sat back, feeling something shift in his chest that he almost didn't trust to be real. Not quite triumph, not yet, but something close enough to make his hands unsteady where they rested on the table. "When do we file?" I want Eleanor Holt's statement formally entered with the court first, and I want at least one more confirmed heir from these new parcels before we move on the broader fraud claim. Give me 3 weeks, maybe 4. We don't have 3 or 4 weeks, Maribel said grimly. Not at the rate they've been escalating. They've already burned a barn, beaten a man on the road, forged a note against Joseph. What happens when they realize Penny's been digging and that the pattern's bigger than just the Meeker parcel? Tate's expression turned serious. Then we need to move faster than feels comfortable and accept some risk in doing it. I can file the fraud claim on the Meeker parcel alone within the week, formally, in front of a judge. Enough to get an injunction freezing the Tarrant family's water rights claims along Cottonwood Creek while the broader investigation proceeds. It won't be the full case yet, but it'll be public, on record, and it'll force them to fight this in a courtroom instead of in the dark with fire and forged notes. Do it, Caleb said immediately. Whatever risk comes with moving fast, I'd rather take it than wait another month watching this valley burn one barn at a time. The injunction was granted 9 days later, in a crowded territorial courtroom in Brennan City that Caleb hadn't expected to draw nearly the crowd it did. Alliance ranchers who'd ridden 2 days to be present, curious townsfolk who'd heard whispers about the case, and Hollis and Reginald Tarrant themselves sitting stiff and furious in the front row with their own expensive lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Crandall who objected to nearly everything Tate said with the practiced ease of someone paid handsomely to make noise rather than substance. Eleanor Holt's sworn statement was read into the record. The forged transfer chain through the Dallas company was laid out, document by document, in the same careful, methodical detail Maribel had used to first uncover it months earlier. Crandall objected, argued, tried every angle his considerable fee could justify, but the documents spoke for themselves in a way that even his polish couldn't entirely talk around. And the judge, a stern, weathered man named Hargrove who clearly had little patience for theatrics, granted the injunction freezing the Tarrant family's claim to the Cottonwood Creek water rights pending a full investigation. It wasn't a final victory. Tate was careful to remind them all of that more than once in the days that followed, but it was public, it was on record, and for the first time since Caleb had ridden into town to find Otis Pruitt waiting with that foreclosure notice, the Tarrant family found themselves on the defensive instead of the offensive, forced to answer questions in a courtroom instead of asking them with fire and threats out on the open range. Reginald Tarrant cornered Caleb outside the courthouse afterward, his usual easy smile gone entirely, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. "You think this changes anything," Reginald said, his voice low and tight with barely controlled fury. "An injunction. A delay. You think a piece of paper from some judge undoes 2 years of my family building something in that valley? I think it's the first time in 2 years anybody's actually made you answer for what you've been building it with," Caleb said evenly. "Forged signatures, burned barns, beaten men left on the side of the road. That's not building anything, Reginald. That's just theft with better tailoring." Reginald's jaw worked, his composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "You'll regret this, Hartwell. Whatever you think you've won today, my family doesn't lose. Not to men like you, and certainly not to that wife of yours playing lawyer with stolen paperwork." "She's not playing at anything," Caleb said, his voice going hard and flat in a way that made even Reginald take half a step back. "And you'd best remember that the next time you decide to send men out to burn something that belongs to people who never did a single thing to deserve it." He walked away before Reginald could respond, found Maribel waiting at the edge of the courthouse steps with Tate beside her. The Alliance gathered close around them in the thin afternoon light, exhausted and battered, but standing, finally, on ground that felt solid for the first time in longer than any of them could remember. "It's not over," Maribel said quietly, watching Reginald stalk off toward his waiting horse. "He's not the kind of man who accepts losing gracefully. Whatever comes next, it's not going to be gentle." "No," Caleb agreed, looking out at the gathered Alliance. Battered, scarred, but unbroken. Every one of them having paid some real cost for standing together against a family that had spent 2 years counting on exactly the opposite. "But we're not the same valley we were 3 months ago either. Whatever comes next, we're not facing it alone, and we're not facing it without ground to stand on. That's worth more than I think the Tarrants understand yet." Maribel looked at him, something steady and warm passing between them despite the exhaustion etched into both their faces. And for a moment, Standing there on the courthouse steps with the late sun stretching long shadows across the dusty street, Caleb let himself believe what, just for a moment, just enough to hold on to through whatever came next, that they might actually win this thing they'd built together out of nothing but desperation, dirt, and a piece of paper nobody else had bothered to read closely enough to find the truth buried underneath it. Reginald's warning didn't stay idle long. 10 days after the injunction, Wallace Tate rode out to the Hartwell Ranch with a look on his face that told Caleb something had shifted before the man even climbed down from his horse. "They're trying to settle," Tate said, pulling a folded letter from his coat. "Crandall sent this yesterday. Hollis Terrence offering to relinquish claim to the Meeker parcel and the 2 other disputed transfers entirely, quietly, in exchange for the criminal fraud investigation getting dropped before it goes any further." "What do you make of that?" Caleb asked. "I make of it that they're scared," Tate said. "A man who thinks he's going to win doesn't offer to hand back stolen land just to make a problem disappear. Penny found a 4th parcel 2 days ago, by the way. I hadn't told you yet. Same pattern. That's 4 now, Caleb. 4 separate families, most never compensated a cent, watching the Terrence build an empire out of dead men's signatures they never gave." Maribel had come out onto the porch, drying her hands on her apron, listening with the same sharp attention she brought to everything. "If we drop the criminal investigation, they walk away with no real consequence beyond losing land they were never entitled to in the first place. That's not justice, Wallace. That's just returning to even." "I agree," Tate said, "and I told Crandall as much. But I wanted you both to hear the offer directly before I sent a formal refusal. This is your fight as much as it's the law's, and I won't make a decision this size without you in the room." Caleb looked at Maribel, found the same answer already settled in her eyes that had settled in his own chest the moment Tate said the word settle. "Refuse it," Caleb said. "Every family they hurt deserves more than the Terrence quietly giving back what was never theirs to begin with. Otto's barn, Mercer's forged note, the man beaten on the road. None of that gets undone by Hollis Tarrant walking away with his reputation mostly intact and his fortune barely dented." "Refuse it," Maribel echoed. "Let it go in front of a judge. Let the whole valley see exactly what they were built on." Tate nodded slowly, something satisfied settling into his tired face. "I was hoping you'd say that." The criminal trial began 6 weeks later, in the same Brennan City courtroom where the injunction had been granted, except this time the crowd that filled the benches stretched out the courthouse doors and into the street, word of the case having traveled the kind of distance that only genuine scandal could carry. It took 4 days. Eleanor Holt testified, her voice steady despite the way Crandall tried to rattle her on cross-examination. Aldous Penny testified, laying out the documented pattern across 4 separate land parcels, with the same careful, methodical clarity he'd brought to pulling those files in the first place. A handwriting expert Tate had brought from the territorial capital confirmed that the signature on the Meeker transfer didn't match any known sample of Eleanor's actual handwriting, not even close enough to pass casual inspection. And on the 3rd day, something happened that none of them had fully anticipated. Otis Pruitt, the bank manager who'd first delivered Caleb's foreclosure notice all those months back, took the stand and, under careful, patient questioning from Tate, admitted that Hollis Tarrant had personally instructed him to fast-track loan approvals for land purchases tied to the suspicious chain of Dallas company sales, without the usual scrutiny the bank applied to other transactions. "Did you ever question why these particular transactions moved through so quickly, with so little documentation?" Tate asked. Pruitt sat there a long moment, visibly miserable, glancing once toward Hollis Tarrant, where he sat rigid and furious at the defense table. "I had concerns," he admitted finally. "I raised them once, quietly, to Mr. Tarrant directly. He made it clear that my position at the bank depended on not raising them again." The courtroom went very quiet at that, and Caleb, sitting beside Maribel in the gallery, felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't fully expected to feel. Not triumph exactly, but something close to relief. The particular relief of watching a lie that had cost so many people so much finally crack open in front of witnesses who couldn't unhear it. The judge's ruling came on the 5th day. Hollis Tarrant was found responsible for orchestrating a pattern of land fraud across 4 documented parcels, ordered to return all 4 to their rightful heirs or descendants. fined an amount substantial enough to make even a man of his wealth wince visibly when it was read aloud, and referred for further criminal proceedings regarding the forged documents themselves. Reginald, implicated in the more recent harassment campaign against the Alliance ranchers through testimony from Otto Reyes and the beaten wagon driver, faced his own separate charges, though the judge noted, not without some weary cynicism, that money of the kind the Tarrant family still possessed had a way of softening even criminal consequences in ways that civil judgments could not. It wasn't perfect justice. Tate said as much to them outside the courthouse afterward, the late afternoon light slanting gold across the gathered alliance, all of them looking simultaneously exhausted and lighter than Caleb had seen any of them look in months. They'll likely buy their way to reduced sentences. Money like that doesn't disappear just because a judge rules against it. But the land goes back, the patterns exposed on permanent record in front of the whole territory. And the water rights along Cottonwood Creek revert to fair distribution, which means this valley doesn't have to live under their thumb anymore, whatever happens to Hollis and Reginald personally. It's not everything, Caleb said, watching the Alliance ranchers embracing each other in the street, Otto Reyes laughing for what looked like the first time in months, despite the scars still visible on his hands, the Caldwell sisters crying openly without any apparent shame about it. But it's enough. It's more than I think any of us actually believed we'd get, riding into this valley 3 months ago. It's enough, Maribel agreed quietly, slipping her hand into his without either of them quite remarking on when that had become a natural thing to do. Imperfect, but enough. I think that's usually the most any of us actually get, fighting for something worth fighting for. Perfect justice is a story people tell. Enough justice is what people like us actually manage to build, piece by piece, when we refuse to stop trying. The valley changed slowly after that, the way real things change rather than the way stories sometimes pretend they do. Not overnight, not without setbacks, but steadily, season by season, in ways that became impossible to deny the longer Caleb and Maribel stayed to watch it happen. The water rights reverted to fair distribution within the month, freeing up Cottonwood Creek for every small rancher who'd been slowly strangled by Tarrant control for 2 years running. Combined with the spring on Hartwell land and the rotational grazing methods Maribel had introduced, the Alliance ranchers found themselves, for the first time in longer than most of them could remember, actually building something instead of just surviving it. Otto Reyes rebuilt his barn before the first snow, with half the valley turning out to help raise the new structure in a single long, exhausting, satisfying day that ended with more food and laughter than Larkspur Hollow had seen in years. Joseph Mercer's forged note was formally voided, his name cleared, his small spread growing steady enough over the following year that he started talking, cautiously, about expanding his herd for the first time since the drought had begun. The Caldwell sisters, no longer treated as a curiosity to be pitied or dismissed, found themselves consulted regularly by other ranchers in the valley, their hard-won expertise finally recognized for what it had always been worth. And the Hartwell Ranch itself transformed in ways that went beyond anything Caleb could have imagined standing in that bank office all those months back, staring at a foreclosure notice and seeing nothing but the end of everything his father had built. The rotational grazing spread beyond the original alliance, other ranchers further out in the valley adopting the method once they saw the results with their own eyes. Fatter cattle, greener pasture, less land lost to overgrazing each season. Maribel's small herb garden grew into something larger, a proper cash crop that brought buyers out from 3 different towns, and the careful, meticulous bookkeeping she'd brought to the Hartwell ledgers that first night eventually turned into something like a reputation of her own. Ranchers from outside the alliance occasionally riding out just to ask her advice on their own accounts. The same woman who'd once been mocked behind her back at the dry goods store now sought out for the very sharpness that town had once tried to shame her for. "Funny how that works," Pete said one evening, sitting on the porch with Caleb and Maribel as the sun went down gold and easy over pasture that had been dust 8 months earlier and was now thick with grass. "Same folks who used to whisper about you behind their hands now riding 2 hours just to hear what you think about their books." "People believe whatever's easiest to believe until something forces them to believe different," Maribel said, not without a trace of dry humor in her voice. "I didn't change, Pete. I'm the same woman I was the day Caleb found me pulling weeds in that bean patch, wondering why I'd bothered crossing 2 states for a fresh start that looked exactly like the old unkindness wearing a different town's name. The only thing that changed is that this valley finally had a reason to look past what they assumed they already knew. Still, Pete said, took some real grit, doing what you did. Don't sell that short. I won't, Maribel said, and Caleb, watching her in the fading light, saw something settled and at peace in her face that hadn't been there in those early, cautious weeks of their marriage. The look of someone who had finally, after a long and difficult road, found a place where her worth wasn't something she had to keep proving over and over against a town determined not to see it. It was almost a full year to the day after that first desperate ride out to the Ainsley Garden that Caleb finally said the thing he'd been carrying quiet in his chest since somewhere around that long night, camped on the trail back from Dry Fork, watching Maribel plan strategy by firelight with the same fierce focus she brought to everything that mattered to her. They were standing by the same spring that had started it all, water running clear and steady through irrigation channels that now stretched far enough to touch a dozen different properties across the valley, green and alive in a way the whole region had nearly forgotten it could be. I never thanked you properly, Caleb said, for any of it. The spring, the alliance. Riding 2 days into Brennan City with nothing but a stack of old surveys and enough stubbornness to actually find the truth nobody else bothered looking for. You don't owe me thanks, Caleb. We built this together. That was the deal, from the very first day. It was, Caleb agreed. But somewhere along the way it stopped feeling like a deal to me, Maribel. I don't know exactly when. Maybe it was the night you found that spring marking on my father's old survey. Maybe it was watching you turn that stampede with nothing but a lantern and more courage than sense. Maybe it was just every single ordinary evening since, sitting on that porch, watching you read ledgers like other folks read love letters. He turned to face her fully, his heart doing something awkward and unfamiliar in his chest. The same kind of nervous he'd felt riding up to that bean patch a year ago, except entirely different in every way that mattered. I married you because I needed a wife. And I told you plain I couldn't offer romance. And I meant it at the time because I didn't know any better. I know better now. I love you, Maribel, not as a partner, or not only as a partner, as my wife, plain and simple, the way I should have had the sense to mean it from the start if I'd known then what I know now. Maribel was quiet for a long moment, her eyes bright in a way that told Caleb everything he needed to know before she found the words to say it herself. I told myself for months I wasn't going to let myself hope for this, she said finally, her voice thick. Told myself it was foolish, getting attached to something that started as a business arrangement, especially for a woman who'd spent her whole life learning not to expect anybody to choose her for anything beyond convenience. She reached up, touching his face gently, the same gesture he'd offered her in the ashes of the burned barn months earlier. I love you too, Caleb. Have for longer than I probably should admit, given how plain I was always saying I only wanted a fair partnership. I just didn't trust it would last long enough to be worth saying out loud. It's lasted this long, Caleb said. I don't see any reason it stops now. Whatever words might have come next dissolved into something that needed no words at all. The two of them standing together by the spring that had saved everything, the water running clear and constant behind them, the valley spread out wide and green, and finally, after so long, at peace. Years later, when people from towns far beyond Larkspur Hollow began traveling out just to see the cooperative water system that had transformed an entire dying valley into one of the most productive ranching regions in the territory, they'd often ask Caleb and Maribel Hartwell how it all started, how a struggling ranch on the edge of foreclosure had become the center of something so much larger than any single property line could contain. Caleb usually let Maribel answer that question because she always told it better than he could. It started with a marriage nobody believed in, she'd say. Between two people the whole county had already written off for different reasons. People assumed it would end badly because that's what people assume about things they don't understand and don't bother trying to. But the truth is, the things worth building rarely come easy, and the people worth trusting are rarely the ones everybody else already agrees are worth trusting. Sometimes the only way to find out what somebody's really capable of is to stop listening to what the loudest voices in the room have already decided about them, and give them the fair chance nobody else bothered to give. It wasn't a smooth story. not in the telling and not in the living of it. There had been burned barns and stolen cattle, and a man beaten half to death on a lonely road, debts that nearly broke them, and a fight that asked more of an entire valley than any of them had been prepared to give when it started. Nothing about it had come easy, and nothing about it had come without real cost, paid by real people who carried the scars of that fight, visible and otherwise, for the rest of their lives. But the ranch survived. The valley survived, stronger and more unified than it had been in a generation, no longer divided into desperate, isolated holdouts, waiting to be picked apart one at a time by anyone with enough money and patience to do it. And Hazel Whitmore, no, that had never been her name in this telling, but the shape of the lesson was the same regardless of what anyone called her. Maribel Hartwell, the woman the whole county had once dismissed as nothing more than an unfortunate solution to a desperate man's problem, became, in the end, the very reason that desperate man had anything left worth saving at all. Worth, Caleb came to understand, watching his wife build something lasting out of nothing but old surveys, hard work, and a refusal to let cruelty define what she was capable of, was never about how a person looked standing in a doorway or how loud a town could be when it decided to laugh at someone it had never bothered to actually know. It was about what a person did when everything was stacked against them, and nobody expected them to do anything at all. The spring still ran clear all these years later, feeding a valley that had once nearly died of thirst and cruelty both. And every season it ran, it carried with it the same quiet truth that had started everything, that the people the world is quickest to dismiss are very often the ones who end up saving it, if anyone's ever brave enough to give them the chance.